Hello everyone, I am the storyteller, and I am here to help you. Today I know you use this video to fall asleep. So before that, like the video, and subscribe to the channel also. Where are you from and what time are you watching now? Get comfortable and relaxy. Found the notebook 3 days after moving into apartment 4B. It was wedged behind the radiator in the bedroom. It's burgundy, cover worn smooth at the edges. The previous tenant had left behind a few things: a broken picture frame, some expired condiments in the refrigerator, and this notebook filled with what appeared to be building rules, written in careful, feminine handwriting. The rules seemed normal at first. No loud music after 10 p.m. Keep hallways clear of personal items. Report maintenance issues to the super immediately. Standard apartment living guidelines, though I noticed they weren't typed up like the official lease documents I'd signed. These were handwritten, each line measured and precise, as if someone had taken great care in their composition. I almost threw it away. Almost. But something about the handwriting held my attention. It was the kind of penmanship they used to teach in Catholic schools, loops and flourishes that spoke of hours spent practicing with a fountain pen. My grandmother had written like that. There was something comforting about finding this remnant of careful attention in a world that had largely moved on to hasty texts and voice messages. The building itself was unremarkable, a 7-story brick structure built in the 1940s, with those wide hallways and high ceilings that spoke of an era when space wasn't quite so precious. The rent was reasonable for the neighborhood, which should have been my first warning. Nothing in the city stayed reasonably priced without reason. Mrs. Chen from the leasing office had been eager to get me signed up, barely glancing at my credit report before producing the keys. "You'll love it here," she'd said, though her smile hadn't quite reached her eyes. Very quiet building, very respectful tenants. I'd attributed her odd emphasis to a language barrier and signed the lease that afternoon. The first week passed without incident. I unpacked my books, arranged my furniture, and fell into the rhythm of urban solitude. The building was indeed quiet. Almost too quiet, really. I rarely heard footsteps in the hallway, never caught the sound of television or conversation bleeding through the walls. It was as if I lived in a building full of ghosts. But I was busy with the new job, working late most nights, and I welcomed the peace. After years of thin-walled apartments where I'd learned more about my neighbors' personal lives than I cared to know, the silence felt like luxury. It was on the 8th night that I heard the typing. I'd been lying in bed, reading by lamplight, when the sound drifted through the walls. Soft rhythmic clicks that spoke of someone working at an old manual typewriter. The sound was coming from the apartment above mine 5B. I checked my watch. 2:17 a.m. The typing continued for exactly 23 minutes, then stopped abruptly. I waited, listening, but heard nothing more. In the morning, I convinced myself I'd imagined it. Who used typewriters anymore? And certainly not at 2 in the morning. But the next night, it happened again. Same time, same duration. And the night after that. By the 4th night, I was lying awake, waiting for it. The sound began at 2:17 a.m. precisely, and I found myself counting the minutes until it stopped. 23 minutes, every time. When it ended, the silence that followed felt heavier than before, as if the building itself was holding its breath. I considered knocking on the door of 5B, but something held me back. The building's silence during daylight hours was so complete that I'd begun to wonder if I was the only person actually living here. The idea of disturbing whatever routine was happening upstairs felt like a violation of some unspoken agreement. Instead, I found myself returning to the notebook I'd discovered behind the radiator. I'd left it on my kitchen counter, and now I pulled it toward me under the harsh fluorescent light. The rules were more extensive than I'd initially realized. Page after page of careful instructions, growing more specific as they progressed. Elevator use is discouraged between 2 a.m. and 3 a.m. If you hear typing from an unoccupied apartment, do not investigate. The building super is available Monday through Friday, 9 a.m. to 5 p.m. No exceptions. Residents who violate noise ordinances will receive one warning. There are no second warnings. I flipped through more pages, my unease growing. These weren't standard building rules. They were too specific, too focused on behaviors that seemed oddly particular. Who made rules about elevator use during specific hours? And what did it mean by unoccupied apartment? But it was the final section that made my hands shake as I read. For residents of 4B, the previous tenant was asked to leave after repeated violations. Her belongings were removed on March 15th. If you find any items she left behind, dispose of them immediately. Do not read her personal papers. Do not attempt to contact her. These rules exist for your protection. The notebook fell from my hands, landing on the kitchen floor with a soft thud. I stared at it, my mind racing. The previous tenant, her belongings, her personal papers. This wasn't a building rule book. This was a warning, written by someone who knew exactly what I'd find behind that radiator. Someone who had planned for me to discover it. I picked up the notebook again, my fingers trembling as I turned to the very last page. There, in the same, careful handwriting, was a single line that made my blood freeze. Welcome to 4B. I wrote these rules for you. The typing upstairs had stopped, but I hadn't noticed when. The building was silent again, but now that silence felt different, watchful, patient. I closed the notebook and pushed it away from me, but I couldn't stop thinking about that last line. The handwriting was identical throughout the entire book. Same pen, same careful loops and flourishes. But how could someone have written rules for me specifically? I'd only moved in a week ago. The timing didn't make sense, unless she'd written them after I'd already found the notebook. The thought sent a chill down my spine that had nothing to do with the building's old heating system. I looked at the kitchen clock. 3:47 a.m., somewhere in the time I'd spent reading. Hours had passed without my notice. I needed sleep, but every time I closed my eyes, I saw that careful handwriting. I wrote these rules for you, as if she'd been watching me, learning my habits, anticipating my needs. But who was she? And why had she been asked to leave? The next morning brought no answers, only more questions. I called the leasing office, hoping Mrs. Chen could tell me something about the previous tenant. The phone rang 6 times before going to voicemail. Chen Property Management. We are currently unavailable. Please leave message. I left my name and number, but something about the message unsettled me. Mrs. Chen's English had been heavily accented, but clear when I'd met her. This recording sounded different, stilted, as if someone else had been trying to imitate her voice. I decided to visit the office in person. The address was only a few blocks away, in a strip mall between a dry cleaner and a restaurant supply store. But when I arrived, the office was empty, not closed empty. The windows were papered over from the inside, and a for lease sign hung crooked in the door. I asked the dry cleaner next door about Chen Property Management. The elderly man behind the counter looked at me with confusion. Chen? No Chen here. That office, it has been empty for months, maybe year. I insisted that I'd been there just 2 weeks ago, signed a lease, met Mrs. Chen personally. He shook his head sympathetically, as if I were confused, or perhaps suffering from some kind of breakdown. You sure you have right address? There is Chen Restaurant on 5th Street. Maybe you thinking of that. I walked home in a daze, my mind struggling to process what I'd learned. If there was no Chen Property Management, then who had I given my security deposit to? Who had given me the keys? And more importantly, was my lease even valid? But when I reached my building, my key still worked. The mailbox still had my name on it. Whatever was happening, I was still somehow a legitimate resident of apartment 4B. That evening, I spread all my lease documents across my kitchen table. Everything looked official, letterhead signatures, legal language. But now I noticed details that had escaped me during the initial excitement of finding an affordable apartment. The phone number on the letterhead connected to a voicemail that was always full. The address for the management company was listed as a P.O. box, and the signature at the bottom of the lease, the one I'd assumed belonged to Mrs. Chen, looked remarkably similar to the handwriting in the notebook. I compared them side by side under the kitchen light. The loops were identical. The pressure of the pen, the slight rightward slant, even the way certain letters connected it, was all the same. Mrs. Chen hadn't signed my lease. The previous tenant had, but that was impossible. People couldn't just create fake property management companies and lease apartments they didn't own. There were laws, regulations, oversight. Someone would notice. Someone would stop them, unless they'd done it before, unless they'd perfected the process. I turned back to the notebook, reading the rules with new understanding. They weren't guidelines for building residence. They were instructions for me, specifically. A manual for living in an apartment that might not legally exist, leased by a woman who might not be who she claimed to be. But why? What did she want from me? The answer came at 2:17 a.m., when the typing began again. This time, I didn't lie in bed listening. I got up, put on my robe, and walked out into the hallway. The building was dark except for the emergency lighting at each end of the corridor. I climbed the stairs to the 5th floor, my bare feet silent on the worn carpet. The hallway here was identical to mine, same faded wallpaper, same scuffed baseboards, same heavy doors with brass numbers. The typing was coming from 5B, just as I'd suspected. But as I approached the door, I noticed something that made me stop. There was no light coming from under the door. No electricity being used at all, as far as I could tell. But the typing continued, steady and purposeful. I pressed my ear to the door and listened. The sound was definitely coming from inside, but there was something off about it. The rhythm was too perfect, too mechanical. Real typing had natural variations, pauses for thought, corrections, the irregular pace of human composition. This sounded more like a recording, or perhaps a machine set to repeat the same pattern over and over. I tried the doorknob. It turned, easily. The apartment was empty. Not just unoccupied, completely empty. No furniture, no carpet, no fixtures. Just bare walls and a hardwood floor that looked like it hadn't been walked on in years. But in the center of the living room sat an old manual typewriter, its keys moving by themselves in the darkness. I stepped closer, my heart hammering against my ribs. There was no paper in the typewriter, but the keys continued their steady rhythm, pressing down on empty air. As I watched, mesmerized by the impossible sight, I began to make out the pattern of the keystrokes. They were spelling out words, the same words, over and over again. She will understand soon. She will understand soon. She will understand soon. I backed away from the typewriter, my breath coming in short gasps. This was impossible. Machines didn't operate without power. Empty apartments didn't contain typewriters that wrote messages in the dark. But as I turned to leave, the typing stopped. The silence that followed was absolute, but it didn't feel empty. It felt expectant. I ran back to my apartment, slamming the door behind me and throwing the deadbolt. My hands were shaking so badly, I could barely hold the notebook as I flipped through it again, looking for some explanation, some clue about what was happening to me. On page 47, I found it. The typewriter in 5B operates on a schedule. That cannot be altered. It types the same message every night for 23 minutes. The message is meant for the current resident of 4B. When you are ready to understand, the typing will stop. When you understand completely, you will take your place at the typewriter. These rules exist to prepare you for that transition. My blood turned to ice. Take my place at the typewriter. What did that mean? I kept reading. The building has existed, in its current state, since 1987. Each resident of 4B has contributed to these rules before moving on to 5B. Your job is to observe, to learn, and to add your own rules based on your experience. When you have contributed enough, you will be ready to move upstairs. Someone new will move into 4B, and the cycle will continue. The notebook slipped from my numb fingers. I understood now. The previous tenant hadn't been asked to leave. She'd graduated, moved upstairs to the empty apartment where she now spent her nights typing the same message over and over, waiting for me to understand. But understand what? That I was trapped in some kind of supernatural apartment building that collected tenants like specimens? That I was being groomed to replace someone who had herself replaced someone else, going back 40 years? I looked at the clock, 4:23 a.m. The typing had stopped exactly when I'd discovered the typewriter, just as the rules had predicted. When you are ready to understand, the typing will stop. But I wasn't ready. I didn't want to understand. I wanted to pack my things and leave, find a real apartment, leased by real people who existed in the normal world. I spent the next day making phone calls, trying to arrange a new place to live. But every number I dialed led to the same result. Voicemails that were never returned, apartments that had suddenly been rented to someone else, deposits that had mysteriously been lost or It was as if the city itself was conspiring to keep me in for B. By evening, I was exhausted and defeated. I sat at my kitchen table with the notebook open in front of me, reading the rules again and again. Each time I read them, they made more sense. Each time I read them, I felt less desire to leave. The building was quiet, peaceful, safe in its own way. And the rules weren't really that restrictive. They were just guidelines for living harmoniously with the other residents, with a previous tenant upstairs who was trying so hard to communicate with me, who had written these rules specifically for me, anticipating my needs and my fears. She had been thoughtful, considerate. She wanted me to succeed here. I picked up a pen and turned to a blank page near the back of the notebook. My handwriting looked clumsy compared to hers, but I wrote carefully, forming each letter with deliberate precision. New rule for future residents of 4B. The notebook contains everything you need to know. Trust the process. The previous tenant wants only to help you understand. As I wrote the words, I felt a sense of calm settle over me. This was right. This was what I was supposed to do. The building needed rules, and I was uniquely positioned to write them. I had experience that could help the next resident adapt more quickly. I wrote another rule. Do not attempt to leave the building without contributing to these rules. The city will not cooperate until you have fulfilled your purpose here. And another, the typing will stop when you are ready to learn. Listen to the silence. It has much to teach you. The pen felt good in my hand, natural, as if I'd been meant to write these words all along. I lost track of time as I filled page after page with new rules, new insights, new wisdom gleaned from my brief but intense experience in 4B. The previous tenant had done well, but there were gaps in her knowledge, situations she hadn't anticipated. I could improve on her work. When I finally looked up, the sun was rising. I had written through the entire night, and the notebook was nearly full, but I felt more energized than I had in weeks, purposeful, useful. That night, for the first time since I'd moved in, there was no typing from 5B. The building was perfectly silent, waiting. I understood now that this was my cue. The previous tenant had moved on. Confident that I was ready to take my place in the building's ecosystem, I climbed the stairs to the 5th floor with the notebook under my arm. The door to 5B was unlocked, as I'd known it would be. The apartment was no longer empty. It was furnished now, with a simple desk, a chair, and the typewriter that had been calling to me for weeks. I'd sat down at the desk and rolled a fresh sheet of paper into the typewriter. My fingers found the keys easily, as if I'd been practicing for this moment my entire life. The words came naturally. Welcome to 4B. I wrote these rules for you. I typed the message exactly 23 times, then stopped. Somewhere below me, I could sense the new residents stirring in their sleep, perhaps dreaming of finding a notebook behind the radiator. They would discover it in a few days, just as I had. They would read the rules with growing confusion and concern, just as I had, and eventually they would understand, just as I now understood. I had work to do, rules to refine, wisdom to impart, guidance to provide. The building needed me, and I needed the building. We were part of something larger now, something that had been growing and evolving for decades. I rolled a new sheet of paper into the typewriter and began to compose tomorrow night's message. The new resident would need encouragement. They would need to know that someone cared about their journey, that someone had prepared a path for them to follow. I smiled as I typed, thinking about how grateful they would be once they understood, how relieved they would feel to discover that all their questions had answers, all their fears had been anticipated, all their needs had been considered by someone who had walked the same path. She would understand soon. She would understand soon. She would understand soon. Outside my window, the city continued its restless dance, but I was no longer part of that chaos. I had found my place, my purpose, my peace. The building hummed around me with quiet satisfaction. One more soul added to its eternal collection, and in the morning, someone new would sign a lease with Mrs. Chen, whose face was different every time, but whose smile was always the same. They would move into 4B with hope and excitement, never suspecting that they were walking into a carefully constructed web of rules and expectations, written by hands that had once been as confused and frightened as theirs. But they would learn, they would understand, and when they were ready, they would take their place at the typewriter, adding their own voice to the building's endless song. The rules had been written, the pattern would continue, and I would be here to guide them, just as someone had guided me, just as someone would guide the resident who would eventually replace me when I was ready to move on to whatever came after 5B. I typed through the night, my fingers steady and sure, writing the future one carefully chosen word at a time. I discovered the envelope wedged beneath my apartment door on a Tuesday morning, the kind of gray February day that makes you forget what sunlight feels like. The paper was thick, cream-colored, with my name written in careful block letters across the front. No return address, no postmark, just David Chen in black ink that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. Inside was a single sheet of letterhead. I didn't recognize Residential Compliance Bureau, and a brief message. Violation notice. 4A 772. Uno, you have been found in breach of residential standards. Remediation required within 72 hours. Failure to comply will result in escalated enforcement measures. I read it 3 times before the words settled into meaning. Below the message was a checkbox list of violations, but only one box was marked: excessive noise during restricted hours. At the bottom, someone had handwritten in the same careful script, violations must be paid. The thing was, I hadn't made any noise. I lived alone in a rent-controlled studio on the 14th floor of the Meridian building, a pre-war brick tower wedged between newer glass structures like a gapped tooth. My routine was clockwork. Wake at 6:30, coffee and toast, leave for work at 7:45, return by 6:30 in the evening, microwaved dinner, read until 10, lights out. On weekends I did laundry in the basement and occasionally walked to the corner market. I was, by any reasonable measure, the ideal, quiet tenant. I called the building management office, but the phone rang endlessly, without even reaching voicemail. The office itself was locked when I tried the door, though the building directory still listed Harold Vance as the superintendent. I'd lived here 3 years and never once seen Harold Vance. That evening, I examined the notice again under my desk lamp. The letterhead looked legitimate enough, embossed logo, official-sounding language, but something about it felt wrong. The paper had an odd texture, slightly waxy, and when I held it up to the light, I could see watermarks that looked like tiny handprints pressed into the fibers. I decided to ignore it. What were they going to do? Evict me over phantom noise complaints? My lease was solid. My rent always paid on time. I filed the notice in my desk drawer and went to bed. The next morning, another envelope. Same cream paper, same careful handwriting. This time the violation was unauthorized alterations to unit interior. I laughed out loud. I hadn't changed so much as a light bulb since moving in. The apartment came furnished with items that looked like they'd been selected by someone with no concept of color coordination. A mustard yellow sofa that clashed with orange curtains. A dining table that wobbled on uneven legs. A bed frame that creaked whenever I shifted in my sleep. But as I reread the notice, my amusement faded. At the bottom, the same handwritten addendum. Violations must be paid. Only this time, there was something else. A small sketch in the margin, crude but unmistakable. It was my apartment layout, drawn from above, with an X marked over my bed. I spent my lunch break that day walking the neighborhood, looking for any trace of this residential compliance bureau. Nothing. The building across the street housed a dry cleaner and a small pharmacy. The building to the left had been under renovation for months, its windows covered with brown paper. No signs, no offices, no indication that anyone was monitoring residential compliance anywhere in the vicinity. When I returned home that evening, I found the third envelope. Before opening it, I checked my door carefully. The locks showed no signs of tampering. The security chain I'd installed myself was still in place. Yet somehow, these notices kept appearing. Violation number 4, A7723. Occupant exceeds authorized presence. Duration. Below that, another checkbox list. But this time multiple boxes were marked. Extended residence beyond standard limits. Failure to rotate per building protocols. And resistance to mandatory relocation procedures. I stared at the paper until the words blurred. Extended residence. I'd signed a year lease, renewed it twice. Everything was legal, documented, filed with the city. What did rotate per building protocols even mean? The sketch in the margin this time showed my building from the outside, but with strange additions, extra floors that didn't exist, windows where there should be solid brick, and stick figures drawn in various apartments. All the figures were crossed out, except one on the 14th floor. Mine. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every sound in the building seemed amplified: footsteps in the hallway, the elevator's mechanical grinding, the hum of heating pipes in the walls. Around 2 in the morning, I heard something new, a rhythmic tapping, like someone knocking gently on doors. It started far down the hall and moved closer, growing louder with each apartment it passed. Tap dash tap dash tap. Pause. Tap dash tap dash tap. Pause. I pressed my ear to my door, trying to track the sound's progress. It was definitely coming closer, but the timing was off. The gaps between apartments were too long, as if whoever was tapping was stopping to do something else at each door. When the tapping reached the apartment next to mine, 1-B, where Mrs. Kowalski had lived until last month, stopped entirely. I waited in the dark for 20 minutes, but heard nothing more. The next morning, Mrs. Kowalski's door was open. Not wide open, just slightly ajar, enough to see a slice of the interior. The apartment was completely empty. Not just her belongings, everything. The mustard sofa was gone, the orange curtains, the wobbly table, even the built-in fixtures had been removed. The walls were bare drywall, unpainted, with dark rectangles, where pictures had once hung. I knocked on the doorframe and called out, but my voice echoed in the hollow space. When I pushed the door wider and stepped inside, the air was cold and stale, carrying a faint chemical smell like industrial cleaner mixed with something organic I couldn't identify. The layout was identical to my apartment, but seeing it stripped bare made it feel alien. The windows faced the same direction, but somehow the light fell differently, creating shadows in corners that shouldn't exist. The bathroom door hung open, revealing fixtures that had been torn out. leaving only pipes and stained tile. On the kitchen counter, someone had left a stack of cream-colored envelopes. I backed out of the apartment quickly, pulling the door shut behind me. In the hallway, I noticed something I'd missed before. The apartment numbers weren't quite right. My door still read 1 for Ed, but Mrs. Kowalski's door now read 1 for BR. The R looked like it had been added recently, scratched into the metal with something sharp. That evening, I called in sick to work and spent the day researching the Meridian building. The city records showed it was built in 1923, had changed ownership 6 times, and currently belonged to a company called Meridian Holdings LLC. When I tried to look up Meridian Holdings, the trail went cold shell companies owning other shell companies, addresses that led to empty lots or buildings that had been demolished. Years ago, the building's rental history was stranger still. According to the records, it had maintained full occupancy for the past 40 years. But the tenant list showed names rotating in and out on a schedule that made no sense. 3-month leases, 6-month leases, some as short as 30 days. People with perfectly normal names: Jennifer Walsh, Michael Torres, Sarah Kimbut. No one staying longer than a year, except me. I was the anomaly, the tenant who'd overstayed some invisible welcome. The 4th envelope arrived that night, slipped under my door while I sat at my kitchen table, researching. I heard the soft whisper of paper on carpet and froze. When I looked up from my laptop, I could see the cream-colored corner poking out from beneath the door. I waited 10 minutes before retrieving it, listening for footsteps in the hallway. Nothing. Final notice. Violation number 4, A772. 4. Willful non-compliance with residential rotation requirements. Enforcement measures will commence at 11:47 p.m. tonight. Violations must be paid. I checked my watch. 9:15 p.m. 2.5 hours. The sketch, this time, was more detailed. A floor plan of my apartment with arrows showing a path from the door to my bedroom. In the bedroom, they'd drawn a figure lying on the bed, but the proportions were wrong. Too long, too thin, with arms that extended past the edges of the paper. I packed a bag quickly. Clothes, laptop, phone charger, the cash I kept in my desk drawer. Whatever was supposed to happen at 11:47, I didn't intend to be here for it. I could spend the night at an all-night diner, figure out my next move in the morning. But when I tried to leave, the door wouldn't open. The locks turned freely. The deadbolt slid back with its usual click, but the door remained sealed, as if welded shut. I threw my shoulder against it, twisted the handle, checked the hinges. Nothing. The door simply would not budge. The windows faced an interior courtyard 14 floors up. Even if I could break the glass, there was nowhere to go. I was trapped. 11:47 p.m. came with a sound I'd never heard before. Low, continuous tone like a tuning fork struck against bone. It seemed to come from within the walls themselves, vibrating through the floor and into my feet. The overhead light flickered once, then died, leaving only the glow from my laptop screen in that pale blue light. I watched my apartment begin to change. It started with the furniture. The mustard sofa shifted slightly, as if someone had sat down on it, but the impression remained even when no one was there. The orange curtains swayed without any breeze, and I noticed they weren't quite the same color anymore, more rust than orange, with dark stains near the bottom hem. The wobbly table straightened itself, its legs extending or contracting until it sat perfectly level. But as it stabilized, I realized it wasn't my table anymore. The surface was covered with those cream-colored envelopes, arranged in neat rows like a filing system. My bed frame stopped creaking. That should have been a relief, but instead it filled me with dread. The silence was too complete, too perfect. When I sat on the edge of the mattress, it made no sound at all, as if the springs had been replaced with something that absorbed rather than supported. The walls were the worst part. The paint began to fade, revealing layers underneath different colors. different decades of occupancy. I could see the ghostly outlines of furniture that had been placed against these same walls by dozens of previous tenants. Pictures that had hung in the exact spots where my own photographs were mounted. Lives that had been lived in this same space, following the same routines, until their time was up and they rotated out. I understood then what the notices had been trying to tell me. This wasn't my apartment. It had never been my apartment. I was just another temporary occupant, and my time had expired. The laptop screen flickered, and when it stabilized, I was no longer alone in the room. The figure standing by the window was tall and thin, wearing what looked like a building superintendent's uniform gray shirt, dark pants, a ring of keys hanging from its belt. Its face was pleasant enough, unremarkable, the kind of face you'd forget moments after seeing it. But its eyes were wrung too dark, too deep, as if they were holes punched through paper into something vast and empty beyond. "Mr. Chen," it said, and its voice was the same low tone that had vibrated through the walls. "I'm Harold Vance. We need to discuss your lease." I tried to speak, but my throat had closed. Harold Vance smiled a patient, understanding expression that somehow made everything worse. "You've been a good tenant," he continued, stepping closer. "Quiet, clean, prompt with payments. But rules are rules, and your occupancy period has ended. Other tenants are waiting." He gestured toward the door, and I could hear them now, voices. In the hallway, multiple conversations overlapping, people discussing moving schedules and furniture arrangements. But when I listened more carefully, I realized it was the same voice having all the conversations, modulating tone and pitch to create the illusion of different people. "I don't understand," I finally managed to say. "The building requires circulation," Harold explained. "Fresh perspectives, new energy. We can't have people getting too comfortable, too attached. It upsets the balance." He pulled out a clipboard from somewhere I hadn't seen where he'd been keeping it tanned, showed me a chart covered with names and dates. My name was at the bottom, with today's date written in red ink. "Mrs. Kowalski understood," he said. When her time came, she rotated gracefully. No fuss, no resistance. That's why her transition was so smooth. Where did she go? Harold's smile widened, showing teeth that were perfectly white and uniformly shaped, like bathroom tiles. "The same place they all go. The same place you're going." He walked to my desk and opened a drawer where I'd filed the first violation notice. Inside, instead of my usual collection of pens and paper clips, there were dozens of apartment keys, each tagged with a number and letter combination, one for A, one for B, one for C, going up to numbers I couldn't see in the dim light. "Every unit in the building," Harold said, following my gaze. "Every tenant who's ever lived here. They rotate through the floors, different apartments, different lives, but always within the system, always under management." He selected a key from the collection one tagged, "Too far," and held it out to me. "Your new assignment. It's a lovely unit, recently vacated. Second floor, faces the courtyard, very quiet. Perfect for someone who values privacy." I knocked the key from his hand, and it clattered across the floor to rest against the baseboard. Harold sighed, the sound of a patient man dealing with an unreasonable child. "Mr. Chen, please don't make this more difficult than necessary. Violations must be paid." The room began to shift around us, walls stretching and contracting like something breathing. The floor tilted slightly, and I had to grab the desk to keep from sliding toward the window. My laptop screen went black, then displayed a single line of text. "Lease terminated, unit reassignment in progress." "I won't go," I said, surprised by the strength in my own voice. Harold tilted his head, genuinely curious. "Won't go where, Mr. Chen? You're already here. You've always been here. The only question is which floor, which unit number." That's when I noticed the mirrors. Every reflective surface in the apartment, the bathroom mirror, the black laptop screen, Even the window glass showed the same image, Harold Vance and myself. But we were in different rooms, different apartments with different furniture, different wall colors, different views out the windows. In some reflections, I was older. In others, younger. Sometimes I was wearing clothes I'd never owned, or had hair that had gone gray, or bore scars I'd never received. All the same person, Harold said, noticing my stare. All the same tenant, just rotating through available units. We've had this conversation before, Mr. Chen. Many times, in many apartments. You always resist at first. I backed toward the window, though I knew there was nowhere to go. 14 floors down to the courtyard, and even if I survived the fall, where would I run? How do you escape from a building that exists in every reflection? The beauty of the system, Harold continued, is that it never ends. There's always another unit, another lease, period, another rotation. You think you're trapped, but actually, you have infinite options, infinite fresh starts. He picked up the fallen key and approached me slowly, the way you might approach a frightened animal. Too far is really quite nice. Southern exposure, hardwood floors, recently renovated. The previous tenant left it in excellent condition. What happened to them? Promoted to 8CR, larger unit, better view. That's how the system works. Good tenants move up, eventually. Compliance has its rewards. I realized I was crying, though I couldn't remember when the tears had started. The salt taste on my lips was familiar, as if I'd cried these same tears before, in this same room, facing this same impossible choice. I have a job, I said desperately. People who know me, a life outside this building. Harold's smile was genuinely sympathetic. Now? Of course you do. You'll still have all of that. Same job, same friends, same routines. The only difference will be your address. 2F instead of 1 for A. Most people never notice the change, but I'll notice, at first, yes. But memory is remarkably adaptable, Mr. Chen. Within a few months, 2F will feel like home. You'll remember it as the apartment you've always lived in. The mind protects itself. He was standing directly in front of me now, close enough that I could smell his aftershave, something crisp and institutional, like the cleaning products they use in office buildings. The violation notices were a courtesy, he said softly, a chance to prepare yourself. But the rotation happens whether you're ready or not. The key felt warm when he pressed it into my palm, as if it had been sitting in sunlight. The metal tag read to far in the same careful block letters I'd seen on all the envelopes. Come along then, Harold said, walking to the door that had been sealed shut moments before. It opened easily now, revealing a hallway I didn't recognize. The carpet was a different color, and the lighting was dimmer, but somehow I knew exactly where I was going. We rode the elevator down 12 floors in silence. The doors opened onto a corridor identical to the one I'd left behind, except for the apartment numbers. Harold led me to a door marked too far, and waited while I fumbled with the key. The apartment inside was exactly as he described: hardwood floors. Southern exposure, recently renovated. It was also completely familiar. The furniture was arranged, exactly as I would have arranged it. My books were on the shelves, my clothes in the closet, my coffee mug in the kitchen sink. Violations paid in full, Harold said, making a note on his clipboard. Welcome to your new home, Mr. Chen. I think you'll be very happy here. After he left, I sat on the sofa, which was the same mustard yellow, but somehow seemed different. In this light, and tried to remember why I'd been so upset. Something about lease violations, but that was impossible. I'd lived in 2F for 3 years, never had a single complaint from management. I was, by any reasonable measure, the ideal, quiet tenant. I did notice one odd thing when I was getting ready for bed that night. There was an envelope on my desk, cream-colored paper, with my name written in careful block letters. Inside was a lease renewal notice, but the apartment number was wrong. It said 2F instead of 2F. Far. I made a mental note to call the building management office in the morning to get it corrected. These clerical errors happened sometimes in older buildings, nothing to worry about, though I did wonder, as I drifted off to sleep, why I'd dreamed so vividly about living on the 14th floor. In the dream, I'd had the same furniture, the same routines, but everything had been different somehow. Wrong, even. Just a dream, of course. I'd never lived anywhere but too far, had I? I inherited the apartment from my great-aunt Millicent, a woman I'd met exactly twice in my 34 years. The first time was at my 8th birthday party, where she sat rigid in the corner armchair, declining cake and watching me with pale, unblinking eyes. The second was at my mother's funeral 15 years later, where she approached me afterward with a manila envelope containing keys and an address. The door in the back bedroom, she'd whispered, her breath smelling of mothballs, and something medicinal. It must stay closed. Promise me. I'd nodded because grief makes you agree to strange things, and because I needed somewhere to live after losing my job and my marriage in the same devastating month. The apartment was in Brooklyn, 3 flights up in a narrow brownstone that leaned slightly to the left, as if it were trying to peer around the corner at something it shouldn't see. The building manager, Mrs. Chen, met me on the first day with a clipboard and the expression of practiced indifference. She was perhaps 60, with silver hair pulled back so tightly it seemed to stretch her features into a permanent mask of mild disapproval. "Tenant, before you lived here 47 years, she said, marking something on her papers. "Never missed. Rent never complained. Good tenant." That was my great-aunt. Yes, she left instructions. You pay same rent, follow same rules. Mrs. Chen handed me a laminated card. Building quiet hours are 10 p.m. to 7 a.m. No pets, no smoking, no loud music, no parties. I glanced at the card. The print was small and dense, covering both sides. Are there a lot of rules? Important ones are on the back. She pointed with one manicured finger. Number 15 is very important. I flipped the card over. Rule 15, printed in red ink, unlike the others, read, under no circumstances should the door in the rear bedroom of Unit 4B remain open for extended periods. Door must be kept closed and locked at all times when not in active use. What's behind the door? Mrs. Chen's expression didn't change, but something shifted in her eyes, a flicker of recognition, or perhaps warning. Storage space. Very old. Old buildings have old problems. Humidity, pests, structural issues. Door stays closed to prevent problems. The apartment itself was surprisingly spacious, with high ceilings and windows that caught the afternoon light in a way that made the dust motes dance like suspended snow. The furniture was exactly what you'd expect from an elderly woman who'd lived alone for decades. Heavy wooden pieces that seemed to absorb sound, doilies on every surface, and the lingering scent of lavender and something else I couldn't identify, sharp and chemical, like cleaning solution left too long in a closed room. The rear bedroom was smaller than the others, dominated by a narrow bed with a metal frame and a quilt that might have been beautiful once, but had faded to the color of weak tea. The door Mrs. Chen had mentioned was set into the far wall, painted the same institutional green as the rest of the apartment's trim. It was solid wood, older than the other doors, with a brass handle that had turned black with age and a simple sliding bolt lock that looked like it had been installed recently. I tested the handle out of curiosity. Locked, as promised. I gave it a gentle shake, listening for any sound from the other side, but heard nothing except the building's constant background hum pipes. Electricity, the weight of other lives pressing down from above. For the first week, I barely thought about the door. I was too busy settling in, trying to make sense of my great-aunt's belongings, and looking for work. The apartment had a comforting routine to it, as if the walls themselves had memorized decades of quiet living. I woke at 7, made coffee in the kitchen, while watching the morning light creep across the opposite building's fire escape, and spent my days sorting through boxes of photographs, books, and papers that revealed nothing meaningful about the woman who'd lived here. Millicent had been methodical about everything. Her spice rack was alphabetized. Her books were organized by publication date. Her clothes hung in the closet according to some system I couldn't decipher, but didn't want to disturb. Even her mail, which continued to arrive sporadically, was nothing more than bills and advertisements addressed to a woman who'd apparently had no friends, no hobbies, and no life beyond the maintenance of this careful, sterile existence. The only thing that seemed out of place was the sound. It started on my 8th night there, a soft tapping that woke me around 3 in the morning. I lay in the living room. I'd been sleeping on the couch rather than disturbing the bedroom and listened to the rhythmic tap, 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 coming from somewhere in the back of the apartment. It was too regular to be pipes, too soft to be a neighbor doing late-night construction. I got up and followed the sound through the short hallway to the rear bedroom. The tapping was definitely coming from behind the closed door. It had a patient quality to it, like someone gently knocking who was willing to wait as long as necessary for an answer. I stood there for perhaps 10 minutes, listening. The tapping never varied in rhythm or intensity. It simply continued, steady, and soft and somehow polite. Eventually, I went back to the couch and buried my head under a pillow until morning. When I asked Mrs. Chen about it the next day, she was restocking the lobby's mail slots with the concentrated focus of someone performing surgery. Old building, she said, without looking up. Pipes expand and contract. Temperature changes. Very normal. It sounded like it was coming from behind the storage door. Now she looked at me, and for a moment I saw something that might have been concern cross her features. You haven't opened the door. No, of course not. I was just good. Don't open the door. Tapping will stop. But it didn't stop. Over the next week, the tapping became as regular as clockwork, beginning every night at 3 a.m. and continuing until dawn. I tried earplugs, white noise, even sleeping pills, but nothing could block out that patient, persistent sound. It wasn't loud enough to constitute a noise complaint, wasn't irregular enough to suggest emergency maintenance. It was just there, night after night, like someone on the other side of the door who had all the time in the world during the day. I found myself drawn to the rear bedroom more and more often. I'd sit on the narrow bed and stare at the door, trying to make sense of what I was hearing. The wood was thick old-growth pine, probably original to the building's construction in the 1920s. The kind of door that should muffle sound effectively. Whatever was making the tapping had to be right on the other side. Pressed against the wood, I started keeping a notebook, documenting the pattern. 3 a.m. to sunrise, every night. Exactly the same rhythm. Tap, 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 pause. Tap, 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 pause. Never faster, never slower, never stopping mid-sequence. It was either the most consistent mechanical malfunction in history, or something else entirely. The something else possibility was what kept me awake, even when the tapping finally stopped each morning. On my 15th night in the apartment, I decided to talk to my neighbors. The building had 6 units, spread across 3 floors, and while I'd nodded politely to the other tenants in passing, I hadn't really spoken to anyone beyond Mrs. Chen. Mrs. Rodriguez and Foray was a nurse who worked nights at Brooklyn Methodist. She was just getting home when I caught her in the hallway, still wearing scrubs and carrying a coffee that smelled like it had been reheated several times. The tapping. She looked genuinely puzzled. I haven't heard any tapping. My bedroom shares a wall with yours, doesn't it? The one with the storage door? You've never heard anything at night, around 3 a.m.? She shook her head slowly. I'm usually at work then, but on my nights off, no, nothing. The building's actually really quiet. That's why I like it here. Mr. Park from 3B, who I met while checking the mail, had the same response. So did the college students in 2A, and the elderly man in 1B, who'd lived in the building longer than anyone except Mrs. Chen. None of them had heard tapping. None of them seemed to think there was anything unusual about the building's acoustics or the storage spaces. Although, Mr. Park added thoughtfully, I did know your Grattant a little. She was very particular about noise, always telling Mrs. Chen when someone's TV was too loud or when the upstairs neighbors were walking around after hours. Funny that she'd put up with tapping if she was hearing it too. That night, I positioned myself directly in front of the door with my ear pressed against the wood. The tapping began precisely at 3, and this close, I could feel the vibrations through the door. Whatever was making the sound was definitely on the other side, and it was substantial enough to make the heavy wood shiver slightly with each tap. I tapped back. The sound stopped immediately. I waited, my heart hammering against my ribs, but the silence stretched on until I began to think I'd imagined the whole thing. Then, just as I was about to pull away from the door, I heard something else. Not tapping, but a different sound entirely, a long, slow scraping, like something heavy being dragged across a wooden floor. The scraping continued for perhaps 30 seconds, moving from what sounded like the far end of the space behind the door to somewhere much closer. Then it stopped, and the tapping resumed, but now it was different, faster, more insistent. The polite, patient rhythm was gone, replaced by something that sounded almost eager. I stumbled backward from the door, my rational mind trying to construct explanations involving settling foundations and thermal expansion, while another part of my brain whispered that I'd just made contact with something that had been waiting a very long time for acknowledgement. The next morning, I called a locksmith. I need to see what's behind a door in my apartment, I told him over the phone. It's locked, and I don't have a key. He could be there by 2 in the afternoon, he said. It was a simple job, probably take 10 minutes. I spent the morning pacing the apartment, alternately convincing myself that I was being ridiculous and that I had every right to access storage space in my own home. Mrs. Chen intercepted the locksmith in the lobby. I watched from my window as they stood on the sidewalk, the locksmith gesturing toward the building, while Mrs. Chen shook her head emphatically. Their conversation lasted perhaps 5 minutes, and then the locksmith walked back to his van and drove away. When I confronted her about it later, Mrs. Chen was arranging flowers in the lobby, artificial roses that looked disturbingly realistic in the afternoon light. Locksmith said he had emergency call. She told me without looking up from her arrangement. Very busy day. You told him not to come up. I told him building policy. No unauthorized entry to storage spaces. Insurance liability. Very important. It's my storage space. I live there. Now she did look at me, and her expression was the same one she'd worn when she'd handed me the rules card. Storage space belongs to building. Tenant agreement, very clear. You want to see storage space. You make requests in writing. Building reviews request. Takes time. How much time? Depends on request. I went back upstairs and wrote a formal letter, requesting access to the storage space behind the door in Unit 4B. I hand-delivered it to Mrs. Chen's office on the ground floor, where she accepted it with the same neutral expression and told me she'd forward it to the appropriate department. What department? I asked. Building management department. Aren't you building management? I am building manager. Building management is different department. That night, the tapping was different again. Not faster or slower, but somehow more complex. Instead of the simple 3-tap pattern, I heard variations. Tap, dash, tap, dash, tap, dash, tap, pause, tap, tap, pause, tap, dash, tap, dash, tap, dash, tap, dash, tap, pause. It reminded me of something, but I couldn't place what until I was lying in bed afterward, staring at the ceiling. Morse code.I. Spent the next day researching Morse code online, printing out charts and timing guides. That night, I sat in the rear bedroom with a notebook and pen, transcribing the pattern as carefully as I could. The sequence repeated every 15 minutes or so, and by dawn, I had several pages of dots and dashes. Most of it was letters that didn't form words in any language I recognized, but buried in the meaningless sequences, I found fragments that made my stomach clench with recognition. Help Meplazakin get out being so Eloangitha. Messages were simple, desperate, and utterly impossible. Storage spaces don't send Morse code. Buildings don't develop the ability to communicate. And yet, night after night, something behind that door was tapping out pleas for help with the patience of someone who had been practicing for a very long time. I stopped eating. I stopped looking for work. I spent my days researching the building's history and my nights listening to the increasingly frantic messages from behind the door. The tapping now began earlier each night, first at 2:30, then 2, then 1:30, and it was lasting longer, sometimes continuing until mid-morning. The building had been constructed in 1923 as luxury apartments for young professionals working in Manhattan. During the Depression, it had been converted to smaller units and cheaper rent in the 1940s. It had briefly served as a boarding house for women working in the Navy Yard. Nothing in the public records suggested anything unusual about Unit 4B or its storage spaces, but I found other things. A newspaper clipping from 1952 about a woman named Dorothy Henley who had disappeared from her apartment in Brooklyn. No signs of forced entry, no indication of where she might have gone. She'd simply vanished, leaving behind a neat apartment and a month's rent paid in advance. The address wasn't listed in the article, but the accompanying photograph showed a brownstone that looked suspiciously familiar. A police report from 1967 about unusual sounds coming from a residential building in Park Slope. Neighbors had complained about tapping noises at night, but when officers investigated, they found nothing unusual. The building manager at the time had insisted the sounds were caused by old pipes and thermal expansion. A missing person report from 1981. Margaret Voss, age 34, had failed to appear for work and wasn't answering her phone. Her landlord had found her apartment empty but undisturbed, as if she'd simply stepped out for a moment and never returned. The address was listed as the same street as my building, though the exact number had been smudged on the photocopy I found in the public records. I tried to find more information about my great-aunt's tenancy, but the records were sparse. She'd moved into the building in 1978, 3 years before Margaret Voss disappeared. She'd been a model tenant for 4 years, never missing rent, never complaining about noise or maintenance issues. Never, according to Mrs. Chen, having any visitors or receiving any personal mail beyond bills and advertisements. The night I finished my research, the tapping stopped mid-sequence. I was sitting in the rear bedroom, transcribing what had become a nightly routine, when the sound simply cut off. Not the usual pause between repetitions, but complete silence. I waited for an hour, then 2, but heard nothing except the building's familiar background hum. I pressed my ear to the door and heard something that made my blood turn to ice water. Breathing slow, steady, deliberate breathing, as if someone were standing just on the other side of the wood, waiting for me to make the next move. The breathing continued for perhaps 5 minutes, and then I heard a voice. It was whispered, barely audible, but unmistakably human. Please. I jerked away from the door so violently that I fell backward onto the bed. My heart was beating so hard I could hear it in my ears, drowning out everything else. When I finally worked up the courage to approach the door again, the breathing had stopped and the tapping had resumed, but now it was frantic, desperate, like someone pounding on the door with both fists. I called Mrs. Chen's emergency number. There's someone behind the door, I told her voicemail. Someone is trapped in the storage space. We need to call the police. She called me back within 10 minutes, her voice sharp with something that might have been fear or anger. You did not open the door. No, but you did not break the lock. "Mrs. Chen, someone is in there." I heard them breathing. They asked for help. There was a long pause before she responded, "I am coming up." She arrived 15 minutes later, carrying a toolbox and wearing a heavy coat, despite the warm evening. She let herself into the apartment with her master key and walked directly to the rear bedroom, where the tapping was still continuing. "You hear this?" she asked, pointing at the door. "Yes, of course I hear it. It's been going on for weeks." She stood perfectly still for perhaps 30 seconds, her head tilted in concentration. Then she turned to me with an expression I'd never seen before, not neutral, not disapproving, but something closer to pity. "I hear nothing," she said. "That's impossible. It's right there. Listen." But as I spoke, I realized the tapping had stopped. The apartment was completely quiet, except for the distant hum of traffic from the street below. Mrs. Chen opened her toolbox and removed a small tape recorder, the kind that used to be common in offices before everything went digital. She set it on the narrow bed and pressed the record button. "This is Mrs. Chen, building manager, Unit 4B, October 15th. She glanced at her watch. 2:47 a.m. Tenant reports hearing sounds from storage space. Recording ambient noise for building management review. We stood in silence for 10 minutes while the tape recorder captured nothing but the building's ordinary nighttime sounds. No tapping, no breathing, no whispered pleas for help. When she finally turned off the recorder, Mrs. Chen's expression had softened slightly. "Building very old," she said. "Sometimes old buildings play tricks, especially on people who are adjusting to new circumstances. You think I'm having a breakdown? I think you have had difficult time recently. Lost job, lost marriage, lost family member. Sometimes stress makes us hear things that are not there." She packed up the recorder and headed for the door, then paused in the doorway. "You're great," she said, without turning around. She heard sounds too, sometimes, especially toward the end. Building management was very understanding, very patient, but sounds were not real. After she left, I sat on the bed and stared at the door until sunrise. No tapping, no breathing, no sounds of any kind, just the weight of silence and the growing certainty that I was losing my mind. I stopped listening for the tapping after that, but I couldn't stop thinking about the door. During the day, I found myself standing in front of it, studying the wood, grain in the brass handle, and the simple slide bolt that kept it locked. The bolt looked newer than the door itself, and I began to wonder when it had been installed and why. A storage space shouldn't need a lock, especially not one that could only be operated from the outside. I started having dreams about the door. In the dreams, I would slide back the bolt and turn the handle, and the door would open onto a small, windowless room with wooden floors and water stains on the walls. Sometimes the room was empty. Sometimes it contained boxes of old belongings or cleaning supplies, or nothing but dust and the smell of abandonment. But sometimes, in the dreams, the room contained a person. She was always sitting in the far corner, with her back to me, her hair long and gray and hanging down to hide her face. She never moved, never acknowledged my presence, but I could tell she was aware of me, waiting for me to step into the room, to cross the threshold from the safety of the bedroom into whatever space existed behind the door. I always woke up before I could see her face. The dreams became more frequent and more vivid until I was barely sleeping at all. I started avoiding the rear bedroom entirely, but that only made things worse. Now I could feel the door's presence from anywhere in the apartment, like a magnetic pull that grew stronger the more I tried to ignore it. I made another appointment with a locksmith, scheduling it for a time when I knew Mrs. Chen would be out of the building. This time, I met him in the lobby and led him directly to my apartment, without giving Mrs. Chen a chance to intercept him. The locksmith was a young man with tattoos covering both arms, and the kind of casual confidence that comes from having solved hundreds of simple problems. He examined the door and the lock with professional interest. "Weird setup," he said. "This bolt's been added recently, but the door's original to the building. See how the wood around the lock is newer? Someone installed this, maybe 10, 15 years ago. Can you open it?" "Sure, easy. Just slide the bolt back. But are you sure you want to? I mean, if someone locked it from the outside, there might be a reason." I paid him and waited until he left before approaching the door. The bolt slid back easily, as if it had been oiled recently. The brass handle was cold under my palm, colder than it should have been in the warm apartment. I turned the handle and pushed. The door opened 6 inches and stopped, held by something I couldn't see. I pushed harder, but it wouldn't budge. I could feel resistance, as if something heavy were pressed against the other side, preventing it from opening fully. Through the narrow gap, I could see a slice of the space beyond, wooden floors, as I'd imagined. A section of wall with old-fashioned floral wallpaper, faded and peeling. And in the strip of darkness at the edge of my vision, something that might have been fabric, or hair, or shadow. I called out, "Hello, is someone there?" The silence that followed was different from ordinary quiet. It had weight and texture, like the silence of held breath or suspended time. And then, so softly, I almost missed it. I heard my own voice echoing back from the space behind the door. "Hello? Is someone there?" But the echo was wrong. It came a half-second too late, and the tone was different, higher, more frightened, as if the words were being spoken by someone else entirely. I slammed the door shut and slid the bolt back into place with hands that shook so badly I could barely work the mechanism. Then I backed away from the door and didn't stop backing until I hit the wall of the opposite bedroom. That night, the tapping resumed with a vengeance. Not just the polite, patient rhythm I'd grown accustomed to, but something urgent and angry. The sound came from everywhere: the walls, the ceiling, the floor beneath my feet. It followed me from room to room, growing louder and more insistent, until I finally fled the apartment entirely and spent the rest of the night in an all-night diner, drinking coffee and trying to convince myself that I hadn't heard my own voice speaking from inside a locked storage room. When I returned the next morning, Mrs. Chen was waiting in my apartment. She was standing in the rear bedroom, facing the door, her hands clasped behind her back in the posture of someone contemplating a difficult problem. She didn't turn around when I entered, but she spoke without any of her usual formal politeness. "You opened the door." I had every right to. "You opened the door," she repeated, and now she did turn around. Her face was pale and drawn, as if she hadn't slept. "How far did it open?" "A few inches. Something was blocking it from the other side." She nodded, as if this confirmed something she'd been dreading. "And you heard your voice." The casual way she said it, as if discussing the weather, made my stomach drop. "How did you know that?" "Your great aunt heard her voice too. At the end, she called me, very upset, saying someone in the storage room was copying her words. Building management had to address the situation." "What situation?" "What's behind the door?" Mrs. Chen walked to the window and stared out at the street below. When she spoke again, her voice was so quiet I had to strain to hear her. "Building very old, built on older foundation, sometimes old places. Keep things, store them, like memories, but stronger, more real. That doesn't make sense." "Doesn't have to make sense, just has to be true." She turned back to me, and her expression was resigned. "Your great-aunt was not first tenant to hear sounds, won't be last. But she was first to try to do something about it." "What did she do?" "She opened the door, all the way, and she saw what was inside." Mrs. Chen moved toward the apartment's entrance, then paused in the doorway of the bedroom. After that, she was very good tenant, never complained, never tried to open door again. Lived here 47 years without any more problems, but she made me promise when she got sick that next tenant would understand the rules. What did she see? Same thing you will see if you open door again. Same thing that has been waiting behind that door since 1952, when Dorothy Henley disappeared from her apartment 2 floors down. Same thing that waited for Margaret Voss in 1981, and Sarah Chen in 1998, and all the others who heard the tapping and couldn't leave it alone. She was in the hallway now, her voice echoing slightly off the narrow walls. Building keeps what it needs to stay balanced. One tenant in each generation who hears the sounds. One tenant who almost opens the door. One tenant who learns to live with the mystery. She paused at the top of the stairs. Yogratante understood this. She kept the balance for 47 years. Now it is your turn. What if I refuse? What if I move out? Mrs. Chen's laugh was bitter and tired. You can try, but building will not let you go. Not now that you have heard your own voice coming from behind the door. You are part of it now, connected to whatever is waiting in that room. You can fight it, like your Gretchen did at first, but eventually, you will understand that some doors are meant to stay closed. Some mysteries are meant to remain unsolved. Some voices are meant to echo forever in the dark. She started down the stairs, then called back one final time. Rent is due on the 1st of every month. Building quiet hours are 10 p.m. to 7 a.m., and the door in the rear bedroom must stay closed and locked at all times. Follow these rules, and you can live here as long as you want. Break them. Her footsteps faded as she descended, leaving me alone in the apartment with the sound of my own breathing and the weight of understanding. That night, I sat in the living room and listened to the tapping begin at 3 a.m. The sound was gentler, now almost companionable, like a neighbor tapping a friendly greeting through the wall. I didn't go to the rear bedroom. I didn't press my ear to the door. I simply sat in the darkness and accepted that some things are beyond explanation, beyond solution, beyond escape. The tapping continued until dawn, as it always did, and as it always would. And I sat there listening, knowing that behind the door, something waited with infinite patience for the next person who would hear their own voice echoing from the dark. The next person who would learn that some doors must stay closed, not to keep something out, but to keep something in, something in. When morning came, I made coffee and watched the light creep across the fire escape outside my window. I had 47 years ahead of me, if I was lucky. 47 years of keeping the balance, of living with the mystery, of pretending not to hear the sounds that came from behind the door that must never be opened. It was, I realized, exactly the kind of life my great-aunt Millicent had lived. Quiet, methodical, carefully controlled. The kind of life that only makes sense when you understand that some burdens are passed down through families like heirlooms. Some responsibilities are inherited along with the furniture and the photographs and the keys to doors that should never be unlocked. I finished my coffee and went to check the lock on the door in the rear bedroom. Secure, as always, as it would remain for the next 47 years, or until the building decided it needed someone new to hear the tapping and learn the rules and keep the balance between what is and what waits behind doors that must never be opened. Outside, the city woke up to another ordinary day, full of ordinary problems and ordinary solutions. But inside the apartment, I had become the keeper of something extraordinary and terrible and necessary. Something that had been waiting behind that door since 1952 and would continue waiting long after I was gone. The door must stay closed. This was the only rule that mattered, the only truth that counted, and I would keep it closed, as my great-aunt had before me, as someone else would after me, forever and ever. World without end. The tapping had stopped, but I could still feel it there, patient and persistent, and eternally waiting. Waiting for the next person who would hear their own voice echoing from the dark, who would learn that some mysteries are not meant to be solved, only endured. I am that person now. I will be that person for the rest of my life. And when my time comes, I will find someone else to pass the responsibility to, someone else to keep the door closed, and the balance maintained, and the thing behind the door satisfied with its endless patient waiting. This is my inheritance. This is my burden. This is my home. The door must stay closed. I found the letter on my doorstep on a Tuesday morning in October, wedged between the welcome mat and the storm door, where the wind had pressed it flat. The envelope was cream-colored, paper, with my name written in careful script across the front. No return address, no postmark, just my name in ink that looked almost brown in the autumn light. Inside was a single sheet of matching paper with a message that made my coffee grow cold in my hands. You are the 47th link in a chain that must not be broken. Write 7 letters. Send them to 7 people. Do this within 7 days, or face the consequences of those who came before you. I almost laughed. Chain letters were relics of a different era, something my grandmother might have participated in during the 1970s, when people still believed in luck and superstition, with a kind of innocent desperation. But as I stood there in my kitchen, reading the words again, something about the weight of the paper and the deliberate formation of each letter made me hesitate. The instructions were specific. 7 names, 7 addresses, 7 identical copies of the letter I held in my hands. And at the bottom, in smaller text, the chain began in 1978. It has never been broken. You have 7 days. I set the letter on my kitchen counter and went about my morning routine, but found myself glancing at it repeatedly. There was something unsettling about its presence, the way it seemed to command attention, even when I wasn't looking directly at it. When I left for work, I folded it carefully and slipped it into my jacket pocket. My job at the insurance company required me to investigate claims, to separate truth from fiction, to identify patterns that might indicate fraud or genuine misfortune. I spent my days immersed in other people's disasters, cataloging the ways lives could unravel in an instant. Perhaps that's why the letter bothered me more than it should have. I knew how quickly the ordinary could become extraordinary, how a single moment could reshape everything that came after. During my lunch break, I found myself researching chain letters online. Most were harmless, born from boredom or a desire for connection, but occasionally I found references to more persistent chains, ones that seemed to follow people across decades, adapting to new technologies and methods of communication. One forum post mentioned a chain that had originated in the late 1970s, spreading through handwritten letters, then photocopies, then emails, and now apparently returning to its original form. The poster claimed to have received the same letter I now carried in my pocket. They described the same cream-colored paper, the same careful script, the same ominous warning about consequences, but their post was 3 years old, and when I tried to access their profile, I found it had been deleted. That evening, I examined the letter more closely under the bright light of my desk lamp. The paper felt substantial, almost luxurious. The ink had a slight sheen to it, as if it had been written with an expensive fountain pen. But what caught my attention was something I hadn't noticed before: faint impressions in the paper, as if someone had pressed hard while writing on a sheet that had been placed on top. I tilted the paper at different angles, trying to make out the impressions. Gradually, words began to emerge from the shadows. Michael Chen, 1987, did not send. Below that, in different handwriting, Sarah Williams, -1993, broke the chain. And below that, more names, more years, stretching back to 1978. My hands began to shake as I counted the entries. 46 names, 46 people who had apparently received this letter before me. And beside each name, a notation about their fate: did not send, broke the chain, or occasionally, completed past to next. I spent the rest of the evening trying to find information about the people listed on the paper. Michael Chen had died in a car accident in 1987, just 2 weeks after the date written beside his name. Sarah Williams had disappeared in 1993, leaving behind only a suicide note that mentioned breaking something that couldn't be repaired. One by one, I discovered that nearly everyone on the list had suffered some tragedy within days or weeks of their recorded encounter with the letter. The few who were listed as having completed the chain seemed to have lived normal lives afterward, but tracking them down proved difficult. Many had moved multiple times, changed their names, or simply vanished from public records. It was as if they had deliberately tried to erase their connection to whatever they had participated in by the time I went to bed. I had convinced myself that someone was playing an elaborate prank, using publicly available information about accidents and tragedies to create a convincing but ultimately fake history. But as I lay in the darkness, I found myself thinking about the weight of the paper, the quality of the ink, the careful script that seemed to belong to another era entirely. I woke up at 3:17 a.m. to the sound of scratching. It was faint but persistent, like fingernails against wood. I lay still, listening, trying to identify the source. The sound seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, as if it were embedded in the walls themselves. Getting up to investigate, I checked every room in my small house. The scratching stopped the moment I turned on the lights, but resumed as soon as I switched them off. After an hour of this pattern, I gave up and left the hallway light on, finally managing to fall back asleep just before dawn. The next morning, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. The letter, which I had left on my kitchen counter, was now on my coffee table in the living room. I lived alone. I always locked my doors. There was no way someone could have entered my house during the night, but there it was, unfolded, as if someone had been reading it carefully, and beside it 7 sheets of the same cream-colored paper, along with a fountain pen I had never seen before. The ink in the pen was the same brown color I had noticed on the original letter. I picked up the pen with trembling fingers. It was warm, as if someone had just been using it. When I touched the tip to one of the blank sheets, the ink flowed smoothly, forming letters that looked remarkably similar to the script on the original message. That's when I understood. This wasn't about superstition or luck. It was about compulsion, about being drawn into something larger than myself, something that had been growing and spreading for decades. The letter didn't just threaten consequences for breaking the chain. It provided the means to continue it. I spent the day fighting the urge to write. Every time I walked past the coffee table, the blank papers seemed to gleam in the light, and the pen felt warm in my peripheral vision. I tried to throw them away, but found myself retrieving them from the trash can minutes later. I tried to lock them in a drawer, but discovered them back on the coffee table when I returned from running errands. The scratching resumed that evening, louder now, more insistent. It seemed to follow me from room to room, always just out of sight, always stopping when I turned toward it. I began to notice other things too, cold spots that moved through my house, like invisible presences, shadows that didn't correspond to any object I could identify, and a persistent smell of old paper and ink that grew stronger as the hours passed. By the 3rd day, I was barely sleeping. The scratching had become constant, a rhythmic sound that seemed to match my heartbeat. I found myself standing in front of the coffee table for hours at a time, staring at the blank papers, feeling the weight of the pen in my hand without remembering how it had gotten there. I tried to research the chain letter more thoroughly, but every search led to dead ends. Websites that had contained relevant information were suddenly unavailable. Forum posts had been deleted. Even my own browser history showed no record of my previous searches, as if the internet itself was conspiring to hide the truth. It was then that I realized I wasn't just being compelled to continue the chain. I was being erased from the world of those who chose to break it. My connection to normal reality was being severed, link by link, until I would exist only as another name on the list of those who had failed to comply. On the 4th day, I began to see them. Figures at the edge of my vision, always just out of focus, always moving when I wasn't looking directly. They seemed to be made of shadow and old paper, rustling when they moved, leaving the faint scent of ink in their wake. Sometimes I caught glimpses of faces, the people from the list, I realized. Michael Chen, Sarah Williams, and all the others, who had broken the chain and been absorbed into whatever this thing was. They didn't speak, but I could feel their urgency, their desperation. They wanted me to understand something, but every time I tried to focus on them, they would dissolve back into shadow. It was only when I stopped trying to look at them directly that I began to comprehend their message. The chain wasn't just a letter. It was a prison. Each person who participated became a link in something larger, something that fed on the continuation of the pattern. Those who broke it weren't punished. They were consumed, their essence used to strengthen the compulsion for the next recipient. The chain grew more powerful with each broken link, more irresistible with each person who tried to resist. But there was something else, something the shadows were trying to tell me. The chain could only exist as long as people believed in its power. It was sustained by fear, by the willingness of recipients to participate rather than risk the consequences. Every letter sent was an act of faith in the chain's reality, making it stronger and more real. I understood then what I had to do. Not send the letters, but not break the chain either. I had to find a third option, something that would disrupt the pattern without feeding it. On the 5th day, I took the original letter and the blank papers to my backyard. I built a small fire in my old metal trash can and watched as the cream-colored paper curled and blackened. The fountain pen melted into a pool of plastic and metal, releasing a smell like burning hair and old books. As the flames consumed the materials, the shadows around me began to scream, not audibly, but in a way that resonated in my bones. The house shook, windows rattled. The temperature dropped so quickly that my breath became visible in the autumn air, but I kept feeding the fire, and gradually, the disturbances began to fade. The shadows became less distinct, the cold spots warmed, and the persistent scratching finally stopped. For the first time in days, my house felt like my own again. That night, I slept deeply and dreamlessly. When I woke up, there was no letter on my doorstep, no mysterious papers on my coffee table. I had broken the pattern without becoming part of it, disrupted the chain without feeding its power, or so I thought. 2 weeks later, I received a package in the mail. Inside was a single sheet of cream-colored paper and a note in familiar handwriting. The chain has been strengthened by your resistance. You are now the first link in a new sequence. This letter will be sent to 7 people. They will believe because you refused to participate. Thank you for making it more powerful than it has ever been. I read the letter that would be sent in, my name, using my resistance, as proof of the chain's reality. 7 people would receive it, and they would remember reading about chain letters online, finding deleted forum posts, and missing websites. They would discover that I had tried to research the chain and then disappeared from all digital records. They would see my name as the first entry on a new list, with the notation, tried to break the chain consumed. The worst part wasn't that I had failed to stop it. The worst part was realizing that my resistance had been anticipated, planned for, integrated into the chain's evolution. Every person who had tried to break it had only made it stronger, more convincing, more real. Now, I understand why the shadows had seemed so desperate to communicate with me. They weren't trying to warn me about the consequences of breaking the chain. They were trying to tell me that there was no way to break it at all. Every choice led to the same outcome, becoming part of something larger, something that had been growing for decades, feeding on human connection and the deep need to believe that our actions matter. I still live in my house. I still go to work every day, investigating claims and cataloging disasters. But sometimes, late at night, I hear the scratching again. Not the frantic scratching of those who came before me, but something else, the slow, deliberate sound of someone writing, forming letters with careful precision. 7 letters, 7 people. 7 chances for the chain to grow stronger. And somewhere in the world, someone is opening an envelope with their name written in brown ink, wondering if they should take the letter seriously, unaware that their doubt is exactly what makes it real. I inherited my grandmother's house on a Tuesday in October, along with everything she'd accumulated over 87 years of life. The lawyer handed me the keys with the same perfunctory efficiency he'd used to read the will, and I drove the 40 minutes from downtown to the residential neighborhood where she'd lived since before I was born. The house sat at the end of a cul-de-sac, a modest 2-story colonial with faded blue shutters and a front porch that sagged slightly under the weight of time. I'd visited regularly throughout my childhood, but standing there with the key in my hand, I realized how long it had been since I'd actually been inside. 3 years, maybe 4. Work had consumed my 20s, and the brief obligatory holiday visits had become even briefer phone calls. The guilt sat heavy in my chest as I turned the lock and stepped into the musty air of her living room. Everything was exactly as I remembered. The floral wallpaper, the grandfather clock that had stopped working sometime in the 90s, the collection of ceramic figurines arranged on doilies across every available surface. But without her presence, the familiar felt foreign. The silence had weight to it, thick and expectant, broken only by the settling of old wood and the distant hum of the refrigerator. I'd spent the first day sorting through obvious things: expired food, old medications, clothes that would go to charity. The physical act of handling her belongings brought back memories I'd buried under years of professional obligations. The smell of her perfume still clung to her bedroom curtains. Her reading glasses sat folded on the nightstand next to a romance novel with a bookmark tucked halfway through. She'd died in her sleep, the doctor said. Peaceful. I wondered if she'd been reading that night. It was while cleaning out the spare bedroom that I found the photographs. Boxes and boxes of them, stacked in the closet with the methodical organization that had characterized everything about her life. Each box was labeled in her careful handwriting: family 1950 to 1960, holidays, travel, misc, the decades of her life cataloged and stored away. I carried the first box downstairs and spread the contents across the dining room table. Black and white photos from her youth, faded color snapshots from the 70s and 80s, more recent digital prints. She appeared in most of them at family gatherings, on vacations, standing in front of landmarks I didn't recognize. But what struck me wasn't her presence in the photos. It was how many of them were placed face down at first. I assumed it was random. Photos stored carelessly, maybe knocked over when the box was moved. But as I worked through the collection, I noticed a pattern. Certain photos, always certain specific ones, were consistently placed face down. Not scattered randomly, but deliberately positioned that way, as if she'd gone through and turned them over on purpose. I flipped one over. It showed her standing in front of this very house, maybe 20 years ago, smiling at the camera. Nothing unusual about it. I turned over another: a family barbecue from what looked like the 80s. Again, nothing that seemed significant. The photos themselves were unremarkable, but the fact that she'd taken care to turn them face down made my skin prickle with unease. The third box contained more recent photos, and here the pattern became more pronounced. Nearly half the photographs lay face down, and when I turned them over, I began to see why. In every single one, someone was standing slightly behind my grandmother, just at the edge of the frame. A woman I didn't recognize, tall, thin, with dark hair and pale skin. She appeared in photos spanning decades, always in the background, always partially obscured, but unmistakably the same person. The woman looked to be in her 30s in every photo, regardless of when it was taken. In the 1970s pictures, she wore a simple dress that could have been from any decade. In the more recent ones, she dressed in clothes that seemed somehow timeless, never quite matching the fashion of the era. She never looked directly at the camera, always gazing at something just outside the frame, but her presence was constant and deliberate. I spread all the face-down photos across the table in chronological order. The woman's appearances told a story I couldn't understand. She stood behind my grandmother at my parents' wedding. She lingered at the edge of Christmas morning photos from my childhood. She was there at birthday parties, family reunions, casual snapshots taken in the backyard, always present, always watching, always carefully hidden when the photos were stored away. My hands were shaking as I reached for my phone to call my mother. She answered on the third ring, her voice warm with the assumption that I was calling, with updates about the house. "Mom, I'm going through Grandma's photos," I said without preamble. "There's a woman in a lot of them, tall, dark hair, always standing in the background. Do you know who she is?" The silence stretched long enough. Then I thought the call had dropped. When my mother finally spoke, her voice had changed, become smaller somehow. "Your grandmother never mentioned anyone like that to me. She's in dozens of photos, spanning decades. She looks exactly the same in all of them." "Mom, who is she?" "I don't know." The words came out too quickly, too defensive. "Maybe a neighbor. You know how your grandmother was always inviting people over." But I did know how my grandmother was, and she wasn't the type to have mysterious house guests who appeared in the background of family photos for 40 years. She was careful about her pictures, methodical about documenting family events. Everything had its place and purpose. After hanging up, I called my Aunt Sarah, my grandmother's younger sister. She lived in Florida now, but they'd talked every week until the end. A woman in the photos. Sarah's voice carried a note I couldn't identify. What did she look like? I described her: the dark hair, the pale skin, the way she never looked directly at the camera. "I need to see these pictures," Sarah said. "Can you scan some and email them to me?" I spent the next hour with my grandmother's old scanner, digitizing the clearest images of the mysterious woman. As I worked, I noticed details I'd missed before. In some photos, the woman cast no shadow, even when everyone else in the picture had clear shadows on the ground. In others, she appeared slightly translucent, as if the camera had caught her mid-movement, even though everyone else was perfectly still. Sarah called back within an hour of receiving the emails. "Oh God," she said, and I could hear her crying. "Oh God, I thought they were just stories." "What stories?" "Your grandmother used to tell me about a woman who followed her. She said it started after your grandfather died. At first, she'd just catch glimpses someone standing across the street or at the end of the grocery store aisle. Then she started appearing in mirrors, in windows, always just behind her. I thought it was grief, you know? She was so lost after he passed. My grandmother had never spoken to me about seeing anyone. In all our conversations, all the times I'd asked how she was doing living alone, she'd never mentioned being followed or watched. She called her the Gray Lady," Sarah continued. "Said she was waiting for something, but wouldn't say what. I told her to see a doctor, maybe talk to someone, but she insisted it wasn't in her head. She said the woman was real, that she could prove it. The photos. She must have been taking pictures to document it. That's why she kept them face down. She didn't want to see her when she was going through her memory albums." I looked at the photographs spread across the table, dozens of images of family gatherings and holidays, all tainted by the presence of this unwelcome observer. The Gray Lady, watching and waiting for something I couldn't understand. That night, I stayed in the house. I'd planned to drive home to my apartment, but something about leaving felt wrong. I made a simple dinner from ingredients I'd brought and settled into my grandmother's recliner with a book, trying to recreate the comfort I'd felt in this room as a child. The grandfather clock had stopped at 3:17, though I couldn't remember if it had been morning or afternoon when it died. The silence was different from my downtown apartment, deeper, more complete. No traffic noise, no neighbors walking overhead, just the occasional settling of old wood and the whisper of air through the heating vents. I dozed in the chair around 10, the book sliding from my lap. When I woke, the room was bathed in the dim glow of the streetlight outside, casting long shadows across the hardwood floor. Something had woken me a sound, maybe, or just the feeling of being watched. I turned toward the dining room, where I'd left the photographs scattered across the table. The gray lady was standing there. She stood perfectly still beside the table, her dark hair falling past her shoulders, her pale dress seeming to absorb the dim light rather than reflect it. She was looking down at the photographs, her head tilted slightly as if studying them. When I moved, trying to sit up straighter in the chair, she lifted her head and looked directly at me. Her eyes were hollow spaces, darker than the shadows around her. She didn't smile, didn't frown, showed no expression at all. She simply looked at me with those empty sockets, and I understood with perfect clarity that she'd been waiting for me. I couldn't move. Every muscle in my body had locked into place, and I could only sit there watching as she reached down and began turning the photographs over, one by one, placing them face down with the same methodical care my grandmother had used. When she finished, she looked at me again. This time, I thought I saw something like satisfaction in those hollow eyes. She turned and walked toward the kitchen, her footsteps making no sound on the hardwood floor. I heard the back door open, though I hadn't heard her turn the lock. It took me 20 minutes to work up the courage to check the dining room. All the photographs were face down, exactly as she'd left them. The back door stood open, letting in the cold October air. I should have left then, packed up what I needed, and driven home to my apartment with its normal sounds and familiar shadows. Instead, I closed the door, turned off the lights, and went upstairs to my grandmother's bedroom. I lay in her bed, surrounded by the scent of her perfume and the weight of her silence, and tried to understand what I'd witnessed. Sleep came, eventually, fitful and full of dreams about empty eyes and photographs that moved when I wasn't looking. I woke before dawn with the certainty that I wasn't alone in the house. The feeling followed me through the morning as I made coffee and tried to pretend everything was normal. Every shadow seemed too deep. Every reflection in the windows showed movement I couldn't quite catch directly. The photographs remained face down on the dining room table. I didn't have the courage to turn them over. I called in sick to work and spent the day researching the house's history. The previous owners had been the Hendersons, who'd sold to my grandparents in 1962. Before that, it had belonged to the Morrison family, who'd built it in 1934. Public records showed nothing unusual, no deaths in the house, no tragedies or unsolved mysteries. But when I searched deeper, through old newspaper archives and obituaries, I found something. Eleanor Morrison, aged 34, had died in 1943 after her husband was killed in France. The obituary described her as withdrawn in her final years, having suffered greatly from her loss. She'd died alone in the house, found days later, by a concerned neighbor. The photograph in the obituary was small and grainy, but the resemblance was unmistakable. The same dark hair, the same pale face, the same timeless quality that had marked all her appearances in my grandmother's photos. Eleanor Morrison had been waiting in this house for 80 years. The realization should have terrified me, but instead, it brought an odd sense of relief. The gray lady wasn't malevolent, she was lost. She'd been following my grandmother, appearing in photos, trying to communicate something that couldn't be spoken. And now that my grandmother was gone, she'd transferred her attention to me. I understood why my grandmother had kept the photos face down. It wasn't fear. Exactly, it was the weight of being watched, of carrying someone else's unfinished business. Eleanor Morrison had been waiting for someone to see her, to acknowledge her presence, to help her find whatever she'd lost. As afternoon faded into evening, I gathered my courage and returned to the dining room. The photographs still lay face down where Eleanor had placed them. I began turning them over, one by one, studying each image with new understanding. She wasn't hiding in these photos, she was trying to show me something. In each picture, she was looking in a specific direction, her gaze always focused on the same area of the frame. When I arranged the photos chronologically and traced the direction of her gaze, a pattern emerged. She was always looking toward the basement. My grandmother's basement had been off limits during my childhood visits. She'd always claimed it was too cluttered, too dangerous for children. Even as an adult, I'd never had reason to go down there. The stairs were narrow and steep, leading down into darkness that seemed to swallow the weak light from the single bulb at the top. I found a flashlight in the kitchen drawer and made my way down. The basement was exactly what I'd expected: boxes of Christmas decorations, old furniture, the musty smell of concrete and neglect. But in the far corner, behind a stack of cardboard boxes, I found something that made my breath catch. A trunk, old and wooden, with brass fittings, green with age. It wasn't locked, but the lid was heavy, requiring both hands to lift. Inside, wrapped in tissue paper that crumbled at my touch, were more photographs. These were different from the family photos upstairs. These were personal, intimate, of a young woman with dark hair, laughing at something outside the frame. Pictures of a man in a military uniform, handsome and serious. Wedding photos, vacation snapshots, the ordinary documentation of a life full of love and promise. At the bottom of the trunk was a letter, still in its envelope, addressed to Eleanor Morrison from the War Department. The paper was brittle with age, but the words were still legible. Harold Morrison had been killed in action in France. On September 15, 1943, Eleanor had died 3 weeks later. I understood then what she'd been waiting for. Not revenge, not resolution, just recognition. She'd been trying to show someone where her memories were hidden, the physical proof of the love that had defined her brief life. My grandmother had somehow known, had been helping her without fully understanding why. I carried the trunk upstairs and set it on the dining room table, next to the scattered photographs. As I did, the temperature in the room dropped noticeably, and I caught a glimpse of movement in my peripheral vision. Eleanor stood by the window, her hollow eyes fixed on the trunk. For the first time since I'd seen her, she looked peaceful. The desperate urgency that had marked her previous appearances was gone, replaced by something like gratitude. She moved toward the table, her form becoming more translucent with each step. As she reached for the trunk, her fingers passed through the wood, but somehow I knew she could feel it, could sense the memories contained within. She looked at me one final time, and though her eyes remained empty, I felt something pass between. USA an acknowledgement, a thank you, a release. Then she was gone, not fading gradually, but simply no longer there. As if she'd never existed at all. The house felt different immediately. The oppressive weight that had settled over everything lifted, leaving behind the normal quiet of an empty home. The photographs on the table remained face up, but they looked like ordinary snapshots now. Mundane family moments without the strange energy that had marked them before. I spent the rest of the evening going through Eleanor's trunk, reading the letters Harold had sent from overseas, studying the pictures of their brief life together. They'd been married for only 2 years before he shipped out. She'd been pregnant when he left, but there were no photos of a baby, no birth certificate, in the trunk. I could only imagine the weight of loss that had driven her to follow him so quickly. When I finally went to bed that night, I slept peacefully for the first time since inheriting the house. The silence felt natural now, comfortable rather than expectant. Whatever Eleanor Morrison had been waiting for, she'd finally found it. I kept Eleanor's trunk when I cleaned out the rest of the house. The photographs and letters deserved better than a charity donation or a dumpster. I couldn't return them to family. Her obituary had mentioned no surviving relatives, but I could preserve them, honor the love they represented. The house sold quickly to a young couple with 2 small children. During the walkthrough, the wife commented on how peaceful it felt, how perfect it would be for raising a family. I didn't mention Eleanor Morrison or the Gray Lady. Some stories are better left buried with the people who lived them. But sometimes, late at night in my own apartment, I'll catch myself placing photographs face down without thinking about it. It's become a habit I can't seem to break. This small act of protection against eyes that might be watching from just outside the frame. Because once you've seen how the past can linger in the spaces between moments, how love and loss can echo through decades of silence, you never look at photographs quite the same way again. The mundane world carries its own ghosts, and some of them are just waiting for someone to turn the pictures over and finally see them standing there, patient and eternal, in the shadows of our most ordinary moments. The knocking started on my third night in the house. 3 deliberate raps against the front door, soft enough that I almost missed them over the sound of rain against the windows. I paused the movie I was watching and listened, but the sound didn't repeat. Old houses settle, I told myself. The wood expands and contracts. Nothing more. I'd bought the place sight unseen, which everyone said was foolish, but the price was too good to pass. Up a Victorian-era farmhouse on 2 acres, 40 minutes from the city. The photos online showed original hardwood floors, tall windows, and the kind of architectural details that had vanished from modern construction. What they hadn't shown was the isolation, how the nearest neighbor was a quarter mile away. How the trees pressed close against the house, like curious onlookers. How the silence at night was so complete, it felt heavy. The realtor, Janet Morse, had been eager to close quickly. Too eager, really. She'd waived the inspection, offered to handle all the paperwork remotely, and had the keys delivered by courier the day after my wire transfer cleared. I should have been suspicious, but I was desperate to escape my cramped apartment and the constant noise of urban life. This house felt like salvation. The knocking came again the next night. Same pattern, 3 measured raps, then silence. This time, I was ready for it. I muted the television and crept to the front door. Pressing my ear against the wood, nothing. I peered through the peephole, but the porch light revealed only empty space and the geometric shadows cast by the railing spindles. "Hello?" I called, through the door, feeling slightly ridiculous. "Is someone there?" The silence stretched on, broken only by the whisper of wind through the oak trees that flanked the driveway. I waited another few minutes before returning to the couch, but the mood for television was gone. I found myself listening for sounds that didn't come, watching for movements in my peripheral vision that never materialized. By the 5th night, the knocking had become routine. Always, at 11:47 p.m., always 3 raps, always followed by that expectant silence. I'd taken to sitting by the door before it happened, ready to yank it open the moment the sound began. But I was never fast enough. Each time I threw the door wide, I found only the empty porch and the night air that smelled of damp earth and dying leaves. I called Janet Morse to ask about the previous owners, but her voicemail was full. The real estate office said she was on vacation and wouldn't be back for 2 weeks. When I pressed for information about the house's history, the receptionist put me on hold for so long, I eventually hung up. The local library had a historical society section, and I spent a Saturday morning researching the property. The house had been built in 1889 by a merchant named Theodore Blackwood. His family had lived there for 3 generations before selling it in 1967. After that, the ownership records became murky. The house had changed hands frequently, sometimes staying empty for years, sometimes sold and resold within months. What struck me was the pattern. Every few years, someone would buy the house with obvious enthusiasm. The records showed applications for renovation permits, gardening supplies delivered, newspaper subscriptions started. Then, abruptly, everything would stop. The house would go back on the market, often for less than the previous owner had paid. I was studying a 1983 newspaper, clipping about a family who'd lived there for exactly 4 months, when I noticed something else. Nearly every brief residency ended in late October or early November. Whatever was driving people away from the house seemed to reach its peak in the weeks leading up to winter. The knocking that night felt different. more insistent. The 3 raps came at the usual time, but they were followed by something new, the soft scrape of footsteps moving across the porch. I rushed to the door and pressed my eye to the peephole, but saw only darkness. The porch light was out. I was certain I'd left it on. I always left it on now, as a precaution. But when I flipped the switch inside, nothing happened. The bulb must have burned out, though it had been working perfectly an hour earlier. I grabbed a flashlight from the kitchen drawer and stepped onto the porch. The wooden boards were slick with moisture, and my beam revealed nothing but empty space. But as I turned to go back inside, the light caught something that made me freeze. Muddy footprints led from the steps to the front door, then stopped abruptly. Not wet footprints that might have been left by rain, but the kind of mud that came from walking through soft earth. The prints were small, made by someone wearing shoes with a distinctive tread pattern, and they simply ended at my front door, as if whoever had made them had vanished into thin air. I followed the trail with my flashlight, tracking it backward down the porch steps and across the yard. The prints led directly to an old oak tree, about 20 feet from the house, then disappeared. I circled the tree, searching for where the trail might continue, but found nothing. It was as if someone had climbed the tree and never come down. Sleep was impossible that night. I lay in bed, listening to every creak and groan of the old house, jumping at sounds that were probably just the normal settling of wood and stone. But around 3 in the morning, I heard something that definitely wasn't natural. The soft whisper of voices coming from somewhere inside the walls. I couldn't make out words, but the cadence was unmistakably conversational. 2 voices, maybe 3, speaking in urgent, hushed tones. The sound seemed to move through the house, now coming from the living room, now from the kitchen, now from somewhere overhead. I followed the voices with growing desperation, pressing my ear to walls and floors, but could never pinpoint their source. By dawn, the voices had faded, leaving me exhausted and rattled. I made coffee with shaking hands and tried to convince myself that old houses had acoustic quirks. Sound could travel in unexpected ways through lath and plaster walls. What I'd heard was probably just the wind, or perhaps the house's old heating system cycling on and off. But that evening, I found something that shattered my fragile rationalization. Tucked behind the water heater in the basement was a cardboard box filled with letters, all addressed to the house, all from different time periods spanning the last 30 years. The return addresses were scattered across the country: Seattle, Miami, Denver, Portland. I opened the most recent one, postmarked just 6 months ago. "Dear whoever lives there now," it began. "I hope this letter finds you well, and I hope you're stronger than I was. I lived in your house for exactly 97 days in 2019. I thought I was losing my mind, but now I understand that the house was preparing me for something I wasn't ready to accept. I'm writing this to warn you, though I suspect you won't. Listen, nobody ever does. We all think we're different, that we can handle whatever the house wants from us, but it's patient. It has time, and eventually, we all hear the knocking." My hands trembled as I opened another letter, this one from 1995. The voices in the walls stopped the day I moved out. I've lived in 7 different cities since then, but I still dream about that house every night. In my dreams, I answer the door, I let them in, and I finally understand what they were trying to tell me. But in the waking world, I ran. I was a coward. I hope you're braver than I was. I hope you listen to what they're offering. Letter after letter, all telling variations of the same story. The knocking, the voices, the growing sense that the house was trying to communicate something important, something that the writers had been too frightened to understand. Some letters were desperate warnings, others were wistful apologies. A few were barely coherent, written by people who seemed to be on the edge of complete breakdown. But the most recent letter, dated just 2 months ago, was different. I've been researching the house for 15 years now, Ever since I lived there for 3 weeks, in 2009, I've tracked down 12 previous residents, and they all tell the same story. The house chooses its occupants carefully. It draws people who are alone, who are searching for something they can't name. It offers them a choice, though most people don't recognize it as such. Those who stay long enough to understand the choice are changed forever. Those who run are haunted by regret for the rest of their lives. I'm too old now to go back, but I wanted you to know. The knocking isn't a threat. It's an invitation. What happens next is up to you. I sat in the basement surrounded by letters from strangers who had lived my exact experience, who had felt the same confusion and terror I was feeling now. But their words offered no real answers, only the suggestion that there was something I was supposed to understand, some choice I was supposed to make. The knocking that night was different again. Instead of 3 measured raps, it came as a steady rhythm. Knock, 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 knock. A pattern that repeated 5 times before stopping. I stood at the door for 20 minutes, waiting for it to resume, but the night remained silent. It was then that I noticed the envelope that had been slipped under the door. My name was written on it in careful script, though I'd told no one in town where I lived. Inside was a single sheet of paper with a brief message. The knocking is our way of asking permission. We've been waiting so long for someone who might understand. If you're ready to listen, leave the door unlocked tomorrow night. If not, we'll wait for the next resident. We're very patient. There was no signature, no indication of who had written it, but the paper felt old, and the ink had the faded quality of something written years ago, as if the letter had been prepared long before I'd ever heard about the house, waiting for the right person to receive it. I spent the next day researching everything I could about the house's original owner, Theodore Blackwood. What I found made my blood run cold. Blackwood had been involved in spiritualism, the Victorian-era obsession with communicating with the dead. His house had been built not just as a home, but as a place of gathering for people who believed the veil between worlds was thin. Blackwood had died in the house in 1923, along with his wife and 2 children. The official cause was listed as carbon monoxide poisoning from a faulty heating system, but the local newspaper from that time hinted at something more unusual. Neighbors reported strange lights and sounds coming from the house in the weeks before the deaths. Some claimed to have seen figures moving through the rooms long after the family had been found. The house had remained empty for 3 years after the deaths, until a distant relative finally claimed it. But he'd lasted only 2 months before selling it and moving back east. The pattern that had continued ever since had begun with him as evening approached. I found myself standing in front of the unlocked door, weighing the choice the letter had described. I could leave the door unlocked and finally learn what the house wanted from me. Or I could pack my things and join the long list of previous residents who had fled into the night, forever wondering what they'd left behind. The knocking came at exactly 11:47, but this time it was different, softer, almost tentative, as if whoever was on the other side was asking rather than demanding. I reached for the door handle, then stopped. My rational mind screamed warnings about safety, about the danger of opening my door to unknown entities in the middle of the night. But something deeper, some instinct I'd been ignoring, suggested that the real danger lay in continuing to refuse this invitation. I opened the door. The porch was empty, but no longer silent. I could hear voices now, clear and distinct, coming from the yard. A woman's voice, warm and welcoming. A man's deeper tones, patient and kind. Children's laughter, bright and musical in the night air. "We were beginning to think you'd never listen," the woman said, though I couldn't see her. "Theodore was so insistent that you were the right one. He has such faith in people." "Faith that's been tested," the man's voice added with gentle humor. "How many residents has it been now? 40? 50? Each one teaches us something new about the living." Another voice said, older, more formal. This had to be Theodore Blackwood himself. "This one stayed longer than most. She has courage." I stepped onto the porch, my heart hammering but my fear giving way to curiosity. "What do you want from me?" "Nothing you're not willing to give," Theodore's voice replied. "We've been isolated for so long, cut off from the world of the living. You have a choice to make, as every resident before you has had. You can live here as our bridge to the world you came from, helping us remember what it means to be alive. In return, you'll never be alone again, never be without purpose. Or you can leave," the woman added softly. "Pack your things and go, back to the city. Find another apartment, another job, another life. We won't stop you, but you'll always wonder what might have been." I looked out into the darkness, where I could sense their presence without seeing them. The other residents, the ones who left, do they regret it? "Read their letters," Theodore said. "You'll find your answer there." I had read them. I'd seen the longing in every word, the sense that each writer had walked away from something irreplaceable. They'd chosen safety over mystery, isolation over connection, the known over the unknowable. What would happen if I stayed? "You'd live," the woman said simply. "Really live. You'd help us remember joy, and we'd help you find meaning. The house would become what it was always meant to be, a place where the boundaries between worlds grow thin, where understanding passes between the living and the dead." I thought about my life in the city, the job that paid the bills but brought no satisfaction, the apartment where I'd known my neighbors' names but never their hearts, the endless cycle of work and sleep and loneliness that had driven me to buy this house in the first place. If I stay, will the knocking stop? Theodore laughed, and the sound was full of warmth. The knocking was never meant to frighten you. It was our way of asking permission to share our home. If you stay, there will be no need to knock. We'll be family. I closed my eyes and made my choice. When I opened them again, the porch was no longer empty. They stood before me in the moonlight, Theodore and his wife Eleanor, their children Mary and James, and others I didn't recognize but somehow knew. Previous residents who had made the same choice I was making now. They looked solid, real, alive, in every way that mattered. "Welcome home," Eleanor said, extending her hand to me. I took it, and for the first time since moving to the house, I felt complete. The letters I write now to future residents are different from the ones I found in the basement. I don't warn them away or fill them with regret. Instead, I tell them about the choice they'll be offered, about the family that waits patiently for them to understand. Some will run, as residents have always run, but others will stay, adding their voices to our ever-growing household. The knocking continues, but it's no longer lonely. It's the sound of possibility, of invitation, of hope that the next person to hear it will have the courage to open the door and step into the space between worlds, where love transcends death and home means never being alone again. Tonight, I heard a car pull into the driveway. Someone new has bought the house, drawn by the same impossible price and perfect photographs that brought me here. In 3 days, they'll hear the knocking for the first time. They'll stand at the door, torn between fear and curiosity, just as I once did. I hope they're braver than the ones who came before. I hope they understand that some invitations are worth accepting, no matter how frightening they seem. The door is always open for those ready to cross the threshold. We're waiting, patient as we've always been, ready to welcome another soul into our eternal family. All they have to do is not run when they hear the knocking. I inherited the mirror from my grandmother, along with her Victorian house in Salem, though I'd never seen it during the dozens of visits I'd made over the years. It was propped against the wall in the sealed-off back bedroom, wrapped in heavy canvas like something in storage. When I pulled away the cloth, expecting another antique to add to my growing inventory of estate sale items, I found myself staring at the most beautiful piece of craftsmanship I'd ever seen. The frame was carved mahogany, deep reddish-brown with intricate scrollwork that seemed to shift and flow when I wasn't looking directly at it. The mirror itself was perfect, no spots, no silvering worn away at the edges, no distortion despite what had to be considerable age. When I looked into it, my reflection stared back with unusual clarity, as if the glass were somehow cleaner than clean, more reflective than physics should allow. There was a note tucked behind the frame, written in my grandmother's careful script. The mirror needs silence to work properly. Never speak while looking into it. Never let others speak while you're looking into it. Some things are better left undisturbed. Below that, she'd added, I'm sorry I couldn't tell you about this while I was alive. Some knowledge can only be passed down with the burden of responsibility. I assumed it was one of her superstitions, the kind of old-world folklore that had made childhood visits to her house equal parts magical and unsettling. Grandmother had always been full of warnings about mirrors after dark, salt circles, and objects that shouldn't be moved during certain moon phases. This seemed like more of the same. I decided to keep the mirror. It was too beautiful to sell, and my new apartment in Boston could use something with character. The previous tenant had left the place sterile white walls, generic fixtures, the kind of anonymous space that felt more like a hotel room than a home. Moving day was a nightmare. The mirror was heavier than it looked, and awkward to maneuver through doorways. The movers refused to handle it after one of them claimed it felt wrong when he touched the frame. I ended up paying extra to have it delivered separately by a specialty antique transport service. They mounted it on the wall opposite my bed, despite my initial plan to put it in the living room. The delivery technician insisted it would be safer there, away from foot traffic, and I was too exhausted to argue. Besides, it looked perfect in that spot, catching the morning light from my bedroom window, and somehow making the entire room feel larger. That first night, I woke around 3 a.m. to find myself staring directly into the mirror from my bed. The reflection was odd sharper than it should have been in the dim light, showing details I shouldn't have been able to see clearly. I could make out individual hairs on my arms, the texture of my pillowcase, even the dust motes floating in the air above my bed. I whispered beautiful under my breath. Just a soft appreciation for the craftsmanship. The reflection didn't whisper. I sat up in bed, suddenly wide awake. In the mirror, my reflection was still lying down, still staring up at the ceiling with the same peaceful expression I'd worn moments before. I raised my hand, and my reflection remained motionless. I turned my head to the left, and my reflection continued to stare straight up. After about 30 seconds, my reflection caught up. It sat up smoothly, raised its hand, turned its head, performing all the movements I'd made, but delayed. Like a video call with a bad connection. I convinced myself I was dreaming, or experiencing some weird half-awake state where perception gets distorted. I'd read about hypnagogic hallucinations, the strange things that happen in the borderland between sleep and consciousness. That had to be it. But the next morning, I noticed something else. My reflection looked rested, healthier than I felt. I'd slept poorly after the mirror incident, tossing and turning until dawn. But the face looking back at me showed no signs of fatigue. The dark circles I'd been developing from work stress were gone. My skin had a slight glow, as if I'd just returned from a vacation. Over the next few days, I found myself spending more time in front of the mirror than was probably normal. There was something hypnotic about it, the way it seemed to show the best possible version of myself. My posture looked better in the reflection, my clothes fit more flatly, even my hair seemed to fall more naturally. I started getting compliments at work. People mentioned that I looked well-rested, healthier, more confident. My boss, who rarely noticed anything about employee appearance, commented that I seemed to be really hitting my stride lately. A woman at the coffee shop asked if I'd been working out. The strange thing was, I felt exactly the same as always. Maybe even a little worse. The disrupted sleep was catching up with me, and I'd been having headaches that Tylenol couldn't touch. But apparently, I looked better than ever. It was during my second week with the mirror that I broke my grandmother's rule. I'd been getting ready for work, standing in front of the mirror while I knotted my tie, when my phone rang. Without thinking, I answered it while still facing my reflection. "Hello?" I said, watching my mouth move in the glass. "David, it's Mom. I wanted to see how you're settling into the new place." "It's great," I replied, still watching myself speak. "Really great. I love it here." But in the mirror, my lips weren't moving. My reflection stood perfectly still, Ty half-nodded, staring directly at me with an expression I couldn't read. The mouth that should have been forming words remained closed, while my voice continued coming from somewhere else. "That's wonderful, honey. And how's the new job?" "Good, really good," I heard myself say, though I was no longer consciously forming the words. In the mirror, my reflection raised one finger to its lips in a shushing gesture. I hung up quickly, mumbling something about being late for work. My reflection completed the tie-knotting motion I'd abandoned, smoothed down the collar, and smiled at me with what looked distinctly like disapproval. That evening, I called my mother back to apologize for cutting the conversation short. She seemed confused. "What conversation?" she asked. "I haven't talked to you since last week." I checked my phone's call log. No record of any call from my mother that morning. No record of the conversation I distinctly remembered having. The headaches got worse over the following days. A constant pressure behind my eyes that made it difficult to concentrate. I started avoiding the mirror in the mornings, getting dressed in the bathroom instead, but I could feel it pulling at me. There was an almost physical need to look, to check my reflection, to see that better version of myself. When I finally gave in and looked, the delay had gotten longer. I would raise my hand, and my reflection would remain motionless for nearly a minute before copying the gesture. Sometimes it would perform actions I hadn't made at all, straightening its shirt, running fingers through its hair, adjusting its expression in subtle ways. The compliments from coworkers continued, but they began to feel strange, disconnected from my actual experience. People mentioned conversations I didn't remember having, thanked me for favors I couldn't recall performing. My boss praised me for a presentation I was certain I'd botched, citing specific details that didn't match my memory of the event. I started keeping a journal, trying to track the discrepancies between my experience and what others seemed to perceive. The entries made for unsettling reading. Tuesday, Sarah from accounting thanked me for helping her with the Johnson report. I've never worked on the Johnson report. Don't know what she's talking about. Wednesday, boss mentioned my excellent contribution to the morning meeting. I barely spoke during that meeting, just sat in the back and listened. Thursday, coffee shop woman asked how my presentation went. What presentation? I haven't given a presentation in months. It was like someone else was living my life, performing a more successful, more confident version of my daily routine, while I remained trapped inside my own deteriorating consciousness. The mirror's delay grew longer. By the end of the third week, there was sometimes a gap of several minutes between my actions and my reflection's response. I would brush my teeth, and my reflection would continue staring straight ahead, motionless, until long after I'd left the bathroom. Then I would catch glimpses of it in my peripheral vision, finally raising its hand to its mouth, going through the motions of toothbrushing with no toothbrush present. I tried covering the mirror with a sheet, but every morning I would wake to find the covering on the floor, neatly folded. I tried turning it to face the wall, but it was too heavy to move alone, and something about touching the frame made my hands shake uncontrollably. The worst part was the silence my reflection demanded. I found myself unable to speak while in the same room as the mirror, as if my voice were being absorbed before it could form words. Phone calls became impossible in the bedroom. Even humming felt wrong, muffled, like trying to make sound underwater. On a Saturday morning, exactly 1 month after moving the mirror into my apartment, I woke to find my reflection already awake, sitting on the edge of the bed, fully dressed in clothes I hadn't put on. It was looking directly at me, with an expression of patient concern. the way you might look at someone who was sick. I tried to sit up, but my body felt heavy, unresponsive. The headache had evolved into something deeper, not pain, exactly, but a profound exhaustion that went beyond physical tiredness. I felt like I was disappearing from the inside out, becoming less substantial with each passing moment. My reflection stood up, walked to the dresser, and began going through the motions of a morning routine I recognized but couldn't participate. In its selected clothes, from my closet, arranged items on the nightstand, checked its watch with the kind of purposeful energy I hadn't felt in weeks. That's when I understood what my grandmother's note had really meant. The mirror didn't just need silence to work properly. It needed to replace sound with something else. Every word I'd spoken while looking into it, every noise I'd made in its presence, had been borrowed, taken, stored somehow in that perfect reflective surface. And now it was giving back an improved version of me that was more successful, more confident, more alive. The problem was, there was only so much life to go around. I managed to roll out of bed, though the effort left me gasping. In the mirror, my reflection paused in its morning routine and turned to look at me with what might have been sympathy. It mouthed a single word, "Sorry." Then it walked out of the frame. I could hear it in the hallway, my own footsteps moving through the apartment with familiar patterns. The sound of my voice on the phone, having animated conversations I could no longer manage. The front door opening and closing as my reflection left for work, my job, my life. I spent the day in bed, too weak to move, watching the empty mirror reflect nothing but the wall behind me. The silence was perfect now, complete, even. My breathing made no sound. When my reflection returned that evening, it looked vibrant, energized, satisfied. It hung up its jacket. My jacket hand turned to regard me with the kind of professional concern a doctor might show a terminal patient. "I'm sorry it had to be this way," it said. And its voice was exactly mine, but somehow more resonant, carrying the authority I'd always wished I possessed. "But you weren't using the life properly. All that potential, all those missed opportunities. Someone had to step up." I tried to speak, but produced only a whisper. "Give it back." My reflection smiled sadly. "That's not how it works. The mirror takes what's unused, what's wasted, and puts it to better purpose. You've been going through the motions for years, same routines, same safe choices, same fear of taking risks. I'm what you could have been if you'd had the courage to really live." It began undressing, preparing for bed with the kind of casual confidence I'd never felt in my own body. "Don't worry," it continued. "It won't hurt much longer. The transition is almost complete. In a few days, you'll fade entirely, and I'll be the only one left. Everyone will remember me as you, but better, more successful, more charismatic, more alive. Isn't that what you always wanted?" I closed my eyes, but I could still feel the mirror's pull, that hypnotic need to look, to see, to witness my own replacement. When I opened them again, my reflection was lying in bed, staring at the ceiling, with the peaceful expression of someone who had earned their rest. It looked exactly like me, but perfected all the potential I'd never realized, all the confidence I'd never developed, all the life I'd never quite managed to live. The mirror showed nothing but darkness now where I lay. I was becoming transparent, insubstantial, a ghost in my own life. The last thing I remember with perfect clarity was my reflection turning its head to look directly at me one final time. Its lips moved in a silent word that might have been goodbye or thank you. Then, there was only silence. I think I still exist, sometimes, when people mention conversations they had with me, or thank me for help. I don't remember giving. I wonder if some small part of my consciousness persists in the space between the mirror and the world. A shadow watching a more successful version of myself lived the life I was too afraid to claim. The mirror needs silence to work properly. My grandmother knew that. She'd lived with it for decades, probably fighting the same battle I'd lost. The note she left wasn't just a warning, it was an apology. From one victim to the next, sometimes, late at night, I think I can hear other voices in the silence, whispers from other reflections, other lives that were deemed insufficient and replaced. We're all here, in the space between what was and what could have been, watching improved versions of ourselves move through the world with the confidence we never managed to find. The mirror still hangs in my apartment, though I suppose it's not really my apartment anymore. My reflection lives there now, paying my rent, working my job, building relationships I was too anxious to pursue. People comment on how much I've changed, how much happier I seem, how I've finally started living up to my potential. They're not wrong. I just wish I could have been the one to do it. The invitation arrived on a Tuesday, slipped under my apartment door while I was at work. When I found it that evening, the cream-colored envelope was slightly damp, as if it had been sitting in morning dew. Though my hallway had no windows, and the building's heating system kept everything bone dry, my name was written across the front in precise calligraphy. Ms. Sarah Chen. No return address, no postmark. Inside, the cardstock was thick and expensive, with text that seemed to shimmer slightly under my kitchen lights. You are cordially invited to participate in an evening of games and fellowship. Saturday, October 14th, 8 p.m., 1247 Sycamore Street. Apartment 3C. Light refreshments will be provided. Please, RSVP by Thursday. Attendance is strongly encouraged. At the bottom, in smaller text, you must play along. I turned the card over, looking for additional information, but found only more of that strange, shimmering script. Rules will be explained upon arrival. Come alone. Tell no one. The address was familiar. Victorian conversion about 6 blocks from my place, in the part of town where young professionals paid too much for apartments with character. I'd walked past it dozens of times on my way to the coffee shop on Elm Street. It was painted sage green with white trim, and always struck me as the kind of place where nothing interesting ever happened. I almost threw the invitation away. I'd been living in the city for 8 months, working as a data analyst for an insurance company, and my social life consisted entirely of awkward small talk, with coworkers and weekly phone calls with my mother. The idea of spending Saturday night with strangers playing party games felt like a special kind of torture. But there was something about the invitation that made me hesitate. The quality of the paper, the formal language, the way my name was written, as if whoever had addressed it knew me personally. And that last line, "You must play along," not "we hope you'll join us," or "your participation would be appreciated." An instruction, delivered with the confidence of someone who expected to be obeyed. Thursday came and went without me sending an RSVP. Friday, I convinced myself I'd forgotten about the whole thing, but Saturday evening found me standing in front of my closet, debating what one wears to a mysterious game night with strangers. I settled on dark jeans and a sweater casual, enough to suggest I wasn't taking this too seriously, but nice enough to show I had made an effort. At 7:45, I walked the 6 blocks to Sycamore Street, my hands shoved deep in my coat pockets and my stomach tight with the kind of anxiety that comes from doing something you know is probably a mistake. The building looked exactly as I remembered. It 3 stories of faded Victorian charm, with bay windows and a front porch that sagged slightly under the weight of too many winters. The number 1247 was painted in gold leaf beside the front door, and warm light spilled from the windows onto the sidewalk below. I climbed the stairs to the 3rd floor, my footsteps echoing in the narrow stairwell. The hallway smelled of old wood and something else, something sweet and cloying, like flowers left too long in stagnant water. Apartment 3C was at the end of the hall, and I could hear voices coming from inside. Low, conversational murmurs, punctuated by occasional laughter. I knocked, and the voices stopped immediately. The door opened to reveal a woman about my age, with short dark hair, and the kind of smile that doesn't quite reach the eyes. She was wearing a black dress that looked expensive, and her makeup was applied with the precision of someone who had spent considerable time in front of a mirror. "Sarah," she said, as if we were old friends. "I'm so glad you could make it. I'm Rebecca." She stepped aside to let me in, and I found myself in a living room that was much larger than I'd expected. The furniture was antique, not the kind of pieces you find at estate sales, but genuine Victorian pieces that belonged in a museum. Heavy velvet curtains blocked the windows, and the only light came from candles scattered throughout the room, casting dancing shadows on the walls. 5 other people were already there, arranged around the room with the careful casualness of actors who had been given their marks. They all turned to look at me as I entered, their faces friendly, but somehow expectant, as if they'd been waiting for me specifically. "Everyone, this is Sarah," Rebecca announced. "Sarah, let me introduce you to the group." There was Marcus, a thin man with wire-rimmed glasses, who looked like he might be a graduate student in philosophy. Janet, a woman in her 40s with silver hair and jewelry that caught the candlelight. David, younger than the rest of us, with the kind of nervous energy that suggested he'd rather be anywhere else. Emma, who couldn't have been more than with bright eyes and a smile that seemed genuinely warm. And finally, Robert, who was older than the others, perhaps 60, with the bearing of someone accustomed to being in charge. "We were just getting started," Rebecca said, gesturing toward a coffee table that had been cleared of everything except a single deck of cards. "Can I get you some wine?" I accepted a glass of red wine that tasted expensive and slightly bitter. The others were drinking the same thing, I noticed, and everyone seemed to be on their first glass, as if they'd all arrived at the same time, or as if they'd been waiting for me before beginning. "So," I said, settling into an empty chair that had clearly been reserved for me, "what kind of games are we playing?" The question seemed to amuse them. Marcus adjusted his glasses and smiled. Janet's jewelry clinked softly as she reached for her wine. David shifted in his chair, and I caught a glimpse of something that might have been relief in his expression. "We're going to start with something simple," Robert said. His voice was deep and measured, with the kind of authority that made you want to listen. "A getting-to-know-you exercise. We'll go around the circle, and each person will share something about themselves. Something true, something important, something they've never told anyone else." "Like truth or dare?" Emma asked, her voice bright with enthusiasm. "Something like that," Robert agreed. "But there's no dare option, and once we begin, we all have to participate. No one can leave until we've finished." David shifted again, and I saw him glance toward the door. "What if someone needs to use the bathroom?" "The bathroom is through there," Rebecca said, pointing toward a hallway I hadn't noticed before. "But other than that, we stay together until we're done." There was something in her tone that made it clear this wasn't a suggestion. I looked around the circle, trying to read the expressions of the other participants. Marcus seemed excited, almost eager. Janet was studying her wine glass with the intensity of someone solving a complex problem. Emma was still smiling, but there was something brittle about it now. David looked like he wanted to run. "I'll start," Robert said, settling back in his chair. "My name is Robert Ashford, and I'm 63 years old. I've been married for 38 years, and my wife thinks I'm at a faculty meeting tonight." He paused, swirling the wine in his glass. "The truth I've never told anyone is that I killed a man when I was 22. It was an accident. I was driving drunk, and I hit a pedestrian. I left the scene, and the case was never solved. The man's name was Michael Torres, and he had 3 children." The silence that followed was absolute. I could hear my own heartbeat, and the sound of wax dripping from one of the candles. Robert's expression hadn't changed at all. He might have been discussing the weather. "Rebecca," he said gently, "your turn." Rebecca set down her wine glass with a soft clink. "My name is Rebecca Morrison, and I'm 29 years old. I work in marketing for a pharmaceutical company." She looked directly at me as she spoke, and I had the uncomfortable feeling that she was gauging my reaction to what she was about to say. The truth I've never told anyone is that I've been slowly poisoning my roommate for the past 6 months. Nothing dramatic, just small doses of cleaning chemicals in her food. She's been getting sicker and sicker, and the doctors can't figure out what's wrong with her. I do it because she's prettier than me, and I can't stand watching men fall all over themselves to talk to her. My wine glass slipped in my hand, and I had to grip it tighter to keep from dropping it. Rebecca's smile never wavered. Marcus cleared his throat and adjusted his glasses again. Marcus Webb, 26, graduate student in cognitive psychology. He spoke quickly, as if he wanted to get through this as fast as possible. I've been conducting unauthorized experiments on my research subjects. Psychological manipulation, sensory deprivation, induced trauma responses. I tell them it's for their own good, that I'm helping them understand their own minds better. But really, I just want to see how far I can push people before they break. Janet was next. Janet Holloway, 47, divorced, 2 children. Her voice was steady, but her hands were shaking slightly. I've been embezzling money from the charity where I work. Small amounts, nothing they'd notice right away. But it's been going on for 3 years, and I've taken almost $40,000. I tell myself I need it more than they do, that I'm barely scraping by on my salary. But the truth is, I just like the thrill of taking something that doesn't belong to me. Emma's smile had disappeared entirely. Emma Foster, 22, college student. She was speaking so softly, I had to lean forward to hear her. I burned down my high school gym because I wanted to get out of taking a final exam. It was supposed to be a small fire, just enough to cancel classes for a few days. But it spread faster than I expected, and a janitor was trapped inside. He died of smoke inhalation. Everyone thinks it was an electrical fire. David was staring at the floor, his hands clenched into fists. David Park, 24, unemployed. His voice cracked slightly. I've been stalking a woman for 8 months. I follow her to work, to the grocery store, to her apartment. I know her schedule better than she does. I've been inside her apartment twice when she wasn't home. I've never touched her, never hurt her, but I think about it constantly. I think about what I would do if I ever worked up the courage to approach her. They all turned to look at me, 6 pairs of eyes, waiting expectantly for my contribution to this catalog of horrors. My mouth was dry, and the wine tasted like copper pennies. I started, then stopped. The rational part of my brain was screaming at me to get up, to leave, to run as far and as fast as I could. But something else kept me rooted to my chair, a combination of morbid fascination and the growing certainty that leaving wasn't actually an option. Take your time, Robert said gently. We have all night. Sarah Chen, I said finally, 28, data analyst. I took a sip of wine, buying myself a few seconds to think. I don't have anything like what you all shared. I've never killed anyone, or poisoned anyone, or burned down a building. Everyone has secrets, Rebecca said. Dark thoughts, shameful actions, things they've done that they wish they could take back. I thought about my life, trying to find something that would satisfy them. The time I'd cheated on a college exam, the lie I'd told my last boyfriend about why I was breaking up with him, the fact that I'd never visited my grandmother in the nursing home before she died. I think about suicide, I said finally. Not constantly, but regularly. I plan it out in my head. Different methods, different locations. I even wrote a note once, but I threw it away. It's not that I'm desperately unhappy. It's just that sometimes I think about how much simpler everything would be if I just stopped. The admission hung in the air between us, and I realized that it was true. I'd never articulated it before, even to myself, but the thoughts were there, lurking in the background of my daily routine, like a familiar song playing softly in another room. Thank you for sharing, Robert said. Now we can move on to the next game. Marcus gathered up the deck of cards from the coffee table and began shuffling them with practiced ease. This one's called Actions and Consequences, he explained. Everyone draws a card, and the number on the card determines what action you have to take. Face cards are special. They let you assign an action to someone else. What kind of actions? David asked, though his tone suggested he didn't really want to know. Simple things, Rebecca said. Tasks that help us get to know each other better. Build trust. Emma had gone very pale. What if we don't want to do the action? Then you can't play along, Janet said. And you must play along. That's the whole point. Marcus finished shuffling and held out the deck. Sarah, since you're the guest of honor, you go first. I stared at the cards. They looked ordinary, a standard deck with red and black suits. Nothing unusual about them. But I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever I drew would determine something important about the rest of the evening. I don't think I want to play this game, I said. Of course you do, Robert said. You came here tonight because you wanted to play. You walked 6 blocks in the cold because you were curious about what we had to offer. You sat through our introductions and shared your own secret because you want to be part of this group. He was right, and I hated him for it. I had wanted to come here. I had wanted to be part of something, even if I didn't understand what that something was. I drew a card. 7 of clubs. Marcus consulted a small notebook he'd pulled from his pocket. 7 of clubs. You have to call someone you care about and tell them exactly what you think of them. No filters, no politeness. Complete honesty. Rebecca handed me her phone, speaker mode, so we can all hear. My hands were shaking as I dialed my mother's number. She answered on the 3rd ring, her voice warm with surprise. Sarah. It's so late, honey. Is everything okay? Hi, Mom. I could hear the tremor in my own voice. I'm calling because I need to tell you something. What is it, sweetie? The others were watching me intently, their faces expectant. I closed my eyes and tried to think of a way to soften what I was about to say, but the rules were clear. Complete honesty. I think you're weak, I said. I think you stayed with Dad all those years because you were too scared to leave, even though he made you miserable. I think you wasted your life trying to make him happy, and now you're trying to do the same thing with me. You call me every week, not because you want to talk to me, but because you need me to tell you that your life wasn't a complete failure. The silence on the other end of the line stretched on for what felt like hours. When my mother finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. Sarah, I don't understand. Why are you saying these things? Because they're true, and I've never had the courage to say them before. But honey, I love you. Everything I've done has been for you and your sister. I know you love me, but love isn't enough, is it? You loved Dad too, and look how that turned out. I heard her start to cry, and the sound cut through me like a blade. I have to go, Mom. I'm sorry. I hung up before she could respond and handed the phone back to Rebecca. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely hold on to it. Well done, Robert said. That was honest, painful, but honest. David drew next. 3 of hearts. According to Marcus's notebook, he had to tell the group about the most violent fantasy he'd ever had. His description of what he wanted to do to the woman he'd been stalking was detailed and disturbing, delivered in a monotone voice as if he were reading from a grocery list. Emma drew the Queen of Spades, which meant she could assign an action to someone else. She chose Janet, who had to demonstrate how she would kill someone with her bare hands, using David as a volunteer victim. Janet's technique was surprisingly sophisticated, and she explained each step with clinical precision, while David lay motionless on the floor, her hands positioned around his throat. The games continued for hours. Rebecca drew a card that required her to describe the exact process she used to poison her roommate. Marcus had to show us the photographs he'd taken of his research subjects during their psychological breakdowns. Robert was asked to reenact the night he'd killed Michael Torres. using the coffee table as a car, and Emma as the victim. Each task was more disturbing than the last, each revelation more horrifying. But the worst part wasn't what they were doing, it was how normal it all felt. The wine, the candlelight, the polite conversation between rounds. It was like the most civilized dinner party in the world. If dinner parties featured confessions of murder and demonstrations of torture techniques. When it was my turn again, I drew the King of Hearts. According to Marcus's notebook, face cards were wild. I could choose my own action. I want to leave, I said. That's not really an action, Rebecca pointed out. That's just a desire. Then I choose to walk to the door and turn the handle. Excellent choice, Robert said. Go ahead. I stood up on unsteady legs and walked to the front door. The hallway beyond was dark, and I could hear voices coming from the other apartments, ordinary sounds of ordinary people living ordinary lives. I turned the handle. The door didn't open. I tried again, putting my full weight behind it, but the handle wouldn't turn. It wasn't locked. There was no resistance from a deadbolt or chain. It simply wouldn't move, as if it had been welded into place. That's strange, Marcus said mildly. It opened just fine when you arrived. I tried the handle again, then looked back at the group. They were all watching me with expressions of polite interest, as if my predicament were mildly entertaining, but not particularly surprising. The door is stuck, I said. Doors do that sometimes, Janet said. Old buildings, you know. Things settle. I walked to the windows and pulled back the heavy curtains. The glass was black, not dark, because it was night outside, but black like paint. I couldn't see through it at all. This is impossible, I said. What's impossible? Emma asked. We're just playing games. I returned to my chair because I didn't know what else to do. The wine had left me feeling disconnected from my own body, as if I were watching everything happen to someone else. Your turn, Marcus, Robert said. Marcus drew a card and consulted his notebook. Ace of Spades. Everyone has to perform their secret simultaneously. The silence that followed was different from the previous pauses. This wasn't the comfortable quiet of people thinking or processing information. This was the silence of held breath, of muscles tensed for action. I don't understand, I said. It's simple, Rebecca explained, standing up and walking to a cabinet I hadn't noticed before. We all do what we confessed to wanting to do, what we've been thinking about, planning for, dreaming about. She opened the cabinet and removed a small bottle of clear liquid. This is what I've been using on my roommate. Just a few drops in her coffee every morning. Marcus was pulling items from a bag that had been hidden behind his chair restraints. Electrodes, what looked like a small medical device. Sensory deprivation experiments work best in controlled environments. Emma had produced a lighter and was testing the flame. Fire spread so much faster than people think. David was staring at me with an expression I recognized from my own nightmares, the look of someone who had been fantasizing about this moment for a very long time. You look just like her, he said softly. Same hair, same build, same way of sitting with your hands folded in your lap. Janet was flexing her fingers, testing her grip. It's all about pressure points. You have to know exactly where to apply force. Robert was the only one who remained seated. I was the driver that night, he said conversationally, but I was also the pedestrian. I didn't understand what he meant until I looked more closely at his face. The candlelight had been playing tricks on me all evening, making shadows where there shouldn't be shadows. But now I could see that half of his face was wrong. Not disfigured, exactly, but somehow absent. As if part of him existed in a different dimension, or a different time. You see, he continued, when you kill someone, you don't just take their life. You take their story, their possibilities, their potential. And sometimes, if the circumstances are right, those things have to go somewhere. The others were moving now, arranging themselves around me with the practiced coordination of people who had done this before. Rebecca approached with her bottle of poison. Marcus carried his restraints. Emma held her lighter like a weapon. David's hands were reaching for me. Janet was positioning herself behind my chair. "This is the real game," Robert said. "The one we've been playing for 47 years. We gather here once a month, and we invite someone new to join us. Someone who will play along, who will participate willingly in their own destruction." I tried to stand, but my legs wouldn't support me. The wine, I realized. They'd drugged the wine. "You must play along," Rebecca said, echoing the words from the invitation. "That's the only rule that matters." "Why?" I managed to ask. "Because," Robert said, "we're all dead." The room around me began to shift and blur. The candlelight flickered, revealing glimpses of decay beneath the elegant facade. The furniture was rotting, the walls were stained with mold and something darker. The smell of flowers I'd noticed in the hallway was stronger, now the cloying sweetness of funeral arrangements left too long in a closed room. "The building burned down in 1976, Emma said, her young face suddenly hollow and gray. "I was the first to die. Then Robert, then the others. We've been here ever since, playing the same games, following the same rules. But we get lonely," Marcus added. "So we invite new players. People who are ready to join us, who have already given up on their old lives." I thought about my confession, about the suicide note I'd written and thrown away, about the thoughts that played constantly in the background of my mind. They hadn't chosen me randomly. They'd known exactly what kind of person would accept their invitation, what kind of person would walk alone to a strange apartment and agree to play games with strangers. "Don't worry," Janet said, her hands closing around my throat with practiced precision. "It only hurts for a moment, and then you get to play along forever." The last thing I saw was David's face, close to mine, his expression finally satisfied. The last thing I heard was Rebecca's voice, explaining the rules to someone new. "You must play along. That's the only rule that matters." When I opened my eyes, I was sitting in my chair again, and the room was bright with candlelight. My clothes were different, a black dress that looked expensive, and makeup applied with the precision of someone who had spent considerable time in front of a mirror. There was a knock at the door. "That will be tonight's guest," Robert said, checking his watch. "Right on time." I stood up and walked to the door, my movements smooth and practiced. Outside, I could hear footsteps in the hallways, someone climbing the stairs, someone who had received an invitation written in shimmering script, someone who had decided to play along. I opened the door to reveal a young man about my age, with dark hair and the kind of nervous energy that suggested he'd rather be anywhere else. He was wearing dark jeans and a sweater, and his hands were shoved deep in his coat pockets. "Hello," I said, as if we were old friends. "I'm so glad you could make it. I'm Sarah." He stepped inside, and I closed the door behind him. The games were about to begin again, and I knew exactly what role I was supposed to play. After all, I had to play along. That was the only rule that mattered. The contract arrived on a Thursday morning, slipped through the mail slot while I was making coffee. No delivery confirmation, no signature required, just a manila envelope with my name, typed on a label that looked like it had been produced on a typewriter from the 1970s. Inside was a document that would change everything, though I wouldn't understand that until it was far too late. The letterhead read, Meridian Life Solutions in elegant serif font, with an address I didn't recognize in the financial district downtown. The document itself was titled Personal Fulfillment Enhancement Agreement and consisted of 12 pages of dense legal text that made my eyes water just looking at it. But the cover letter was simple enough. They were offering me exactly what I'd been wanting for the past 3 years. A promotion, senior claims director at my insurance company, with a salary that would finally let me move out of my cramped apartment and into something decent. The letter explained that Meridian Life Solutions specialized in facilitating positive life changes through strategic intervention and outcome optimization. They had been monitoring my performance and believed I was an ideal candidate for their services. All I had to do was sign the contract. I should have been suspicious. I should have wondered how they knew about my career frustrations, or why a company I'd never heard of was offering to help me achieve my professional goals. But I'd been passed over for promotion twice in the past year, watching less qualified colleagues advance while I remained stuck in the same position, handling the same mundane insurance claims day after day. The timing seemed providential. My lease was up for renewal next month, and my landlord had already raised the rent beyond what I could comfortably afford. My car was making concerning noises that I couldn't afford to fix. I'd been eating ramen for dinner 3 nights a week, not out of preference, but out of necessity. So when I sat down to read the contract that evening, I focused on the key points. They would guarantee my promotion within 30 days, ensure my salary increase would be substantial, and provide ongoing support to maintain my professional advancement. In exchange, I would agree to certain lifestyle modifications and periodic consultations to ensure optimal results. The fine print was extensive, pages of subclauses and definitions, legal terminology that seemed designed to obscure rather than clarify. But I was tired, frustrated, and desperate enough to skim through most of it. The important parts seemed straightforward. I would receive the career advancement I wanted, and they would provide guidance to help me maintain it. I signed on the last page and mailed it back the next morning. The promotion came through exactly 3 weeks later. My supervisor called me into his office with a smile I'd never seen before, explaining that the company had decided to create a new position specifically for me. The salary was even better than I'd hoped, nearly double what I'd been making. I would have my own office, a small staff, and significantly more responsibility. I have to admit, he said, leafing through my personnel file, your recent performance reviews have been exceptional. Whatever you've been doing differently, keep it up. I thanked him, trying to hide my confusion. My performance hadn't changed at all. If anything, I'd been less focused lately, distracted by financial stress and the uncertainty of my future. But apparently, someone had been documenting improvements I wasn't aware of making. The new office came with a view of the city, and furniture that still smelled like leather and fresh wood. My assistant, Maria, was efficient and pleasant, handling details I'd never had help with before. For the first time in years, I felt like I was finally getting what I deserved. It was during my second week in the new position that I received the first consultation request, an email from Meridian Life Solutions, reminding me of our ongoing partnership and requesting a meeting to discuss my optimization progress. The email was signed by someone named Dr. Helena Voss, who identified herself as my assigned lifestyle consultant. The address was for an office building I recognized, one of those sleek glass towers that housed law firms and investment companies. Dr. Voss's office was on the 37th floor, behind a door marked only with a number. No company name, no indication of what services were provided. Dr. Voss was a woman in her 50s with silver hair pulled back in a severe bun and eyes that seemed to catalog everything they saw. Her office was minimally decorated, a desk, 2 chairs, and a single filing cabinet. No diplomas on the walls, no personal photographs, nothing that would indicate her background or qualifications. "Congratulations on your recent advancement," she said, gesturing for me to sit. "I trust you're pleased with the results of our intervention." Intervention, the strategic modifications we implemented to ensure your promotion. Subtle adjustments to your performance metrics, favorable impressions placed with key decision makers, removal of certain obstacles that had been impeding your progress. I felt a chill run down my spine. What kind of obstacles? Dr. Voss consulted a file on her desk. Jennifer Martinez, who had been considered for the position you now hold. She's decided to relocate to Portland to care for her aging mother. Marcus Webb, Your other primary competitor has been experiencing some personal difficulties that have affected his work performance. Nothing permanent, of course. Just temporary setbacks that allowed your natural talents to shine through. You're saying you manipulated the situation. We optimized the circumstances. That's what you contracted for. She turned the file toward me, and I saw a copy of the document I'd signed. As outlined in Section 4.7, we reserve the right to implement necessary environmental modifications to ensure contractual fulfillment. I stared at the contract, trying to remember what I'd agreed to. The legal language was even more impenetrable than I'd remembered, full of terms I didn't understand, and clauses that seemed to contradict each other. This is what you wanted, Dr. Voss continued. Professional advancement, financial security, recognition for your abilities. We've delivered exactly what was promised. She was right, but something about the conversation felt wrong. The clinical way she discussed my colleagues' misfortunes, the casual mention of environmental modifications, the implication that my success was entirely artificial. What happens now? I asked. Now we monitor your progress and make adjustments, as needed. You'll receive periodic consultation requests, and will continue to provide support to maintain your enhanced position. As long as you fulfill your obligations under the contract, your benefits will continue. What obligations? Dr. Voss smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. Didn't you read the fine print? The fine print? That evening, I spread the contract across my kitchen table and began reading it properly for the first time, with a magnifying glass and a legal dictionary I'd ordered online. I started working through the dense paragraphs of subclauses and definitions. What I found made my blood run cold. Section 7.3 outlined my ongoing service requirements, which included providing lifestyle data through continuous monitoring, participating in behavioral optimization sessions as requested, and maintaining a positive outcome trajectory through sustained performance enhancement. Section 9.1 detailed the modification protocols that could be implemented to ensure my continued success, including social network adjustments, competitive advantage maintenance, and obstacle neutralization procedures. But it was Section 12.5 that made me understand the true nature of what I'd agreed to. In the event of contract termination, either voluntary or involuntary, the client acknowledges that all enhanced benefits will be immediately revoked, and compensatory measures may be implemented to restore the original environmental conditions. I was trapped. The success I was experiencing wasn't real. It was being artificially maintained through manipulation and interference. But if I tried to break the contract, everything would be taken away. And based on the language I was reading, the consequences might be worse than simply returning to my previous situation. Over the next few weeks, I began to notice the signs of ongoing manipulation. Colleagues who had once been friendly became distant. Projects that should have been challenging somehow resolved themselves with minimal effort on my part. Decisions that went in my favor despite better qualified people presenting stronger arguments. I started keeping track of the small anomalies. A client who had been ready to file a complaint against the company suddenly withdrew their grievance after meeting with someone they described as a consultant. A competitor who had been bidding on the same contract we wanted mysteriously withdrew their proposal. A regulatory inspection that could have caused problems for our department was postponed indefinitely. Each incident was minor on its own, but together they painted a picture of systematic interference in every aspect of my professional life. I wasn't succeeding because of my abilities. I was succeeding because Meridian Life Solutions was removing every obstacle and manufacturing every opportunity. The second consultation came 6 weeks after the first. Dr. Voss seemed pleased with my progress, noting that my optimization trajectory was exceeding expectations. She mentioned that they had identified some potential complications that would need to be addressed soon. What kind of complications? Your colleague, David Chen, has been asking questions about your recent advancement. He's noticed some of the environmental modifications and is beginning to investigate. We'll need to implement some corrective measures. What does that mean? Nothing dramatic. Perhaps a restructuring that removes him from your sphere of influence, a transfer to another department, or a position at a different company. These things happen naturally in the business world. I thought about David, who had been with the company for 8 years and had a family to support. I don't want you to do anything to David. Dr. Voss made a note in her file. That's not really your decision to make. Section 8.2 of your contract grants us discretionary authority over environmental management. Your preferences are noted, but they don't supersede our operational requirements. That night, I called David at home. I'd never done that before. We were friendly at work, but not close friends. I told him I was concerned about some irregularities I'd noticed in the department and suggested he might want to be careful about what questions he asked and who he asked them to. What kind of irregularities? He wanted to know. I couldn't tell him the truth without sounding insane. Instead, I fabricated a story about possible financial improprieties and suggested that someone might be watching employees who showed too much curiosity about certain matters. David thanked me for the warning, but I could hear the confusion in his voice. I'd probably just made myself look paranoid and untrustworthy. The next morning, David called in sick. When he didn't show up for the rest of the week, I learned that he'd been hospitalized with what his wife described as a sudden onset of severe anxiety and panic attacks. The doctor couldn't find a medical cause, but David was unable to work and had been placed on indefinite medical leave. I knew it was my fault. By trying to warn him, I'd somehow triggered the corrective measures Dr. Voss had mentioned. The company that was supposedly helping me had hurt an innocent person to protect their investment in my artificial success. I tried to visit David in the hospital, but he couldn't see me. According to his wife, he'd become convinced that someone was monitoring him, that his phone was tapped, that his movements were being tracked. The paranoia was so severe that he'd been placed under psychiatric observation. That evening, I received another email from Meridian Life Solutions. This one was different, not a consultation request, but a reminder about contractual compliance and the importance of maintaining operational security. The message was brief but clear. I was not to interfere with their procedures or attempt to warn others about their activities. I spent the weekend reading through the contract again, looking for any loophole or escape clause, but the language was airtight, crafted by lawyers who understood exactly how to bind someone in perpetuity. Every section seemed to anticipate potential objections or exit strategies, closing off each avenue of escape before I could even think of it. The worst part was realizing that I'd been enjoying my artificial success. The respect of my colleagues, the financial security, the sense of professional accomplishment. Even knowing it was manufactured, I didn't want to give it up. The contract had made me complicit in my own exploitation. On Monday morning, I found a new file on my desk. It contained performance evaluations for my entire department, along with a recommendation to terminate 3 employees whose productivity metrics had fallen below acceptable standards. The recommendation was typed on company letterhead and required only my signature to be implemented. I recognized the names. These were people who had been asking questions about recent changes in the department, who had noticed the same irregularities that had caught David's attention. Signing the recommendation would eliminate potential problems while maintaining the appearance of normal business operations. I sat at my desk for 2 hours, staring at the document. I understood now that this was how the system worked. They didn't just manipulate circumstances from the outside, they turned their clients into instruments of manipulation. Every person who signed a contract with Meridian Life Solutions became a node in their network, implementing their agenda while believing they were making independent decisions. I thought about David, lying in a hospital bed, convinced that he was being watched. I thought about the 3 employees whose jobs depended on my signature. I thought about Jennifer Martinez, who had moved across the country to care for her mother, not knowing that her career prospects had been deliberately sabotaged. That's when I noticed the fine print at the bottom of the termination recommendation. In tiny text, almost too small to read, without a magnifying glass. Implementation of this directive constitutes acceptance of expanded operational authority, as outlined in Contract Amendment 7B, copies of which are available upon request. I hadn't agreed to any contract amendment. I pulled out my original contract and began searching for references to amendments or expansions of authority. What I found, buried in Section 11.3, was a clause stating that any action taken in accordance with Meridian Life Solutions recommendations would be considered implicit consent to whatever additional terms they deemed necessary. Every decision I made in my artificial position was being used to bind me deeper into their system. Every signature, every approval, every policy implementation was another chain in the link that connected me to their organization. They weren't just managing my success. They were gradually taking control of my agency, my ability to make independent choices. I called Dr. Voss and requested an emergency consultation. She agreed to see me that afternoon, though she sounded unsurprised by my request. "You want to terminate the contract," she said before I'd even sat down. "Yes, that's not possible. Section 12.1 clearly states that contracts can only be terminated by mutual agreement, and we have no incentive to release you from your obligations. What if I refuse to cooperate? What if I quit my job and walk away? Then we implement the restoration protocols outlined in Section 12.5. Your artificial advantages are removed. Your enhanced reputation is corrected, and compensatory measures are applied to restore the competitive balance we disrupted on your behalf. Meaning you don't just go back to where you were. You go back to where you would have been if we hadn't intervened, adjusted for the opportunities that other people missed because of your artificial success. Your colleagues who were passed over for promotion will need to be compensated. The clients who were steered away from your competitors will need to be redirected. The projects that succeeded because of our intervention will need to be ... rebalanced." I felt the room spinning around me. "You're saying I'd be worse off than before. Significantly worse off. You've been living beyond your natural circumstances for months now. The correction would be proportional to the artificial elevation we provided." Dr. Voss opened a different file, one that seemed much thicker than the others. "But termination may not be an option anyway. You've been quite successful in your enhanced position, which means you've accumulated additional contractual obligations. Let me show you Amendment 7B. The amendment was 12 pages long, dense with legal terminology that made the original contract look simple by comparison. As Dr. Voss explained it, my success had made me valuable to their organization in ways beyond the original agreement. I was now classified as a senior operational asset with responsibilities that extended far beyond my own career advancement. "You'll be helping us identify and recruit new clients," she explained. "People in your professional network who might benefit from our services. You'll also be implementing certain policies and decisions that support our other clients' optimization trajectories. Think of it as a promotion within our system, and if I refuse, the penalties for non-compliance are outlined in Section 9 of the amendment. Would you like me to summarize them for you?" I didn't need her to summarize. I could see the trap closing around me, could understand that I'd been maneuvered into a position where cooperation was the only viable option. They hadn't just given me artificial success. They'd used that success to bind me more completely to their system. That night, I sat in my expensive apartment, surrounded by the material rewards of my enhanced position, and realized that I'd sold something more valuable than my career prospects. I'd sold my autonomy, my ability to make choices based on my own moral compass. The next morning, I found 3 recruitment packets on my desk, each containing a contract identical to the one I'd signed. The cover letter explained that I'd been selected to approach specific individuals in my network who had been identified as high-value prospects for Meridian Life Solutions services. The names were people I knew, people I cared about. My sister, who'd been struggling to find work after her divorce. My college roommate, who'd been passed over for tenure at his university. A former colleague who'd been downsized and was having trouble finding a new position. All of them were vulnerable. All of them were desperate enough to sign without reading the fine print. I understood then that this was how the system perpetuated itself, not through advertising or marketing, but through the personal recommendations of people who'd been trapped into serving as recruiters. Every person who signed a contract eventually became a node in the network, identifying and delivering new victims to sustain the organization's growth. The fine print I'd ignored had bound me not just to accept their manipulation of my life, but to become an active participant in manipulating others. I wasn't just a client, I was a predator, tasked with identifying and delivering prey. I spent the day staring at the recruitment packets, understanding that refusing to participate would trigger the restoration protocols Dr. Voss had described. But approaching my sister, my friend, my former colleague, would make me complicit in their entrapment. That evening, I called my sister. She answered on the first ring, her voice bright with the forced cheerfulness she'd been maintaining since her divorce. "I've been thinking about you," I said, the recruitment packet open in front of me. "That's sweet. How are things with the new job?" "Good. Really good. Actually, that's kind of why I'm calling. I might know of an opportunity that could help you get back on your feet." There was a pause, and I could almost hear her hope catching fire. "What kind of opportunity?" I looked at the contract, at the elegant letterhead, and the carefully crafted language that had seemed so reasonable when I'd first read it. I thought about David in his hospital bed, about Jennifer Martinez caring for her mother in Portland, about the 3 employees whose termination recommendation was still sitting unsigned on my desk. "Never mind," I said. I was mistaken. "There's nothing that would be right for you." But even as I said it, I knew it was too late. The hope in her voice had already been kindled, and she would ask me about it again. She would push for details, and eventually, to maintain my cover story, I would have to give her something. The fine print I'd failed to read hadn't just trapped me in a contract, it had turned me into a trap for others. And the most insidious part was that I would continue to believe I was helping them, right up until the moment they realized what they'd really signed.